We will conclude now the phase for testing of audio and video. And connected, having done both tests this morning, we have the following delegations: Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, the United States, Grenada, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Peru, the Dominican Republic, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Uruguay. We confirm quorum, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ASG Mendes. Good morning, distinguished permanent representatives, alternate representatives, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Assistant Secretary General, permanent observers, ladies and gentlemen. Following verification of the quorum by the Secretariat, I am pleased to declare open this special meeting of the Permanent Council, which has been convened by the Chair pursuant to the authority vested in Article 37 of the Rules of Procedure for the purpose of considering the topic declining labor productivity rates and the human capital exodus, as contained in the Order of Business document CP OD 2360/22, which I hereby submit for the consideration of this Council. There being no observations or concerns, we will proceed to adopt it without amendment. Dear colleagues, as I stated in the work plan for the Permanent Council under the chairmanship of St. Kitts and Nevis, a few selected matters of great concern to our hemisphere will be addressed. One such important matter of continuing concern is the declining level of productivity in our member states as measured by output per manner. In its very simplest terms, the volume of goods and services produced by each individual has been declining at a disturbingly rapid pace over the past 30 years. And this is the data that's being reported by ECLEC and others. Among the key determinants often cited are low performance ratings on a global ease of doing business index, a review of the World Bank's data for 190 countries, which were ranked under the bank's global ease of doing business index. It shows that only 12 of our 34 OS member states were counted among the top 100 countries. And among this group of 12 OS member states, there are only 2 CARICOM member states that have made the global top 100 list of countries, which have demonstrated the ability to provide a measure of ease in doing business. The last regular session of the OS General Assembly was held under the theme Towards Renewal in the Americas. In this context, and as a direct response to building back our economies and making them more productive and more efficient in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, OS member states are urged to redouble their work efforts to enhance productivity and efficiency. Other factors that influence our productivity levels include poor government arrangements and limited innovations in technology. The damaging effects of these factors are an increase in the cost of doing business, the cost of producing goods and services, a reduction in the volume of highly valued goods and services brought to the marketplace, and an increase in our level of imports. In combination, these factors are harmful to our economies. They trap our member states at low rates of income and economic growth, leaving each, without exception, operating far short of their full productive potential. These debilitating factors are intensified during a major economic contraction. They stand in the way of a vibrant economic recovery from the global pandemic. Within this context, today, We will hear from experts on the topic of declining labor productivity and attendant human capital exodus. Each analyst will be allowed 15 minutes to deliver their initial presentation. Thereafter, I will open the floor to a question and answer session. At the outset, I would also like to inform delegates that Dr. Andrew Selee will not be able to join us until 11:10 a.m. due to an unavoidable work commitment. If delegates have no objection, I will offer him the floor when he actually connects with us. Having said that, I am now honored to open this panel discussion with the initial presenter, Dr. William F. Maloney, Chief Economist for the Latin American region and the Caribbean region of the World Bank. Dr. Maloney joined the World Bank in 1998 as Senior Economist for the Latin American and Caribbean region. He held various positions, including leader economist in the Office of the Chief Economist of Latin America. He was lead economist in the Development Economics Research Group, Chief Economist for Trade and Competitiveness, and Global Lead on Innovation and Productivity, the very subject that we are discussing today. He was most recently Chief Economist for Equitable Growth and Finance. From 2011 to 2014, Dr. Maloney was visiting professor at the University of the Andes, working closely with the Colombian government on innovation and firm upgrading issues. Dr. Maloney received his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley, and in 1980, his Bachelor of Arts degree is from Harvard University, and he also studied at the University of the Andes in Bogota, Colombia. His research activities and publications have focused on issues related to international trade and finance, developing country labor markets, innovation and growth, including several flagship publications about Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Maloney, welcome to the OS Permanent Council. You have the floor, sir.
Good morning to everybody. Muy buenos días a todos. Buen día, bon día, mejor dicho. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, Ambassador Hull, for this kind invitation, and to all of you for convening this session on what is, I think, the critical topic for our region going forward. I'm going to pop up some slides. Let's see if I share screen. Ambassador Hull, can you see that?
Yes, I can indeed, sir.
All right, fantastic. I'm broadly phrasing this as what's needed for takeoff, and I'll explain that why, but I've got this little condorito, this condor from Alejandro Obregón, a Colombian artist, just contemplating what it's going to take to get him to fly. And I think that's our topic today. And we're very fortunate to have Diego Restuccia, who is going to focus, I think, on one particular approach to productivity, which I am entirely aligned with. And for that reason, I'm going to focus on some other issues, which are things that I've been looking at recently, which I think we also need to have on the table. I just want to start by saying that Latin America is stalled and grumpy. And that starts just because our growth has been poor, even leaving aside COVID, which was, of course, a disaster in many ways for our region, more than many others. Growth forecasts going forward are about 2.8% in 2022 and 2.6% in 2023. And you can say that's anomalous, except it's very similar to the fact that before COVID, we were growing very slowly at about 2.2% when the rest of the world was growing at 3.1%. And we can say, oh, okay, well, we're very dependent on commodity prices and those were falling. It's like, okay, that's part of the issue we need to look at, why we remain so dependent on commodities. And but more broadly speaking, productivity accounts in general across the world for about half of this growth. And as I'll show, we've been missing that part almost entirely. Other things that are making Latin America grumpy that I'll just mention, but are not directly on point. COVID is subsiding and vaccination progress is good, but not uniform. Across the Caribbean, for example, we're particularly lagging in some areas where there's resistance, often resistance, and we need to address that because recovery of the tourism sector and many other sectors is going to be dependent on being resistant to whatever the next variant that may come across deals us. There's been modest progress in the region on poverty and inequality. Not nothing, but not as much as we might like. But there's also something that I might call the middle class squeeze, which is because productivity growth has been slow, there's been slow salary growth overall. For those who are now retiring, the pension fund payouts have been below what has often been expected, whether reasonably or not. And public schools across the region remain terrible by international scores. And that's going to be a major problem I'm going to address at the very end. But in any case, we've got a region that is unhappy. And some of that is just because we're not growing. And that has given rise in many countries to a concern that the mainstream growth model is exhausted or never really worked. The big issue, I would say, in Chile is that that's kind of been our bellwether country for trying out this kind of mainstream North American neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, model. And if you just look at this graph, you see that productivity really jumped a lot during that period of reforms from about 1983 to 1997, when there's a lot of reallocation of factors of production from very unproductive firms and activities to more productive firms and activities. But after that, from about 2000 on, we've been pretty stagnant. And in Colombia, just because as a country I spend a lot of time in, we have a similar issue of not very much productivity growth in the last 20 years. Mexico, you can just look at the graph and see what's going on. As I said, we remain volatile and dependent on commodities, and that's an issue. And so how do we go about, as you might expect of the World Bank, I'm not arguing to throw out the model. I think the basic framework of the model that has been employed in many countries remains the most fructiferous, the one that's going to give us the best results over the long time. But I'm not sure we've got the entire solution, and that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 5 things. The first thing is they're broadly, and this is to set up a little bit Diego's talk as well. We normally talk about productivity increasing along 3 different channels. One is between different activities, which I was just talking. During reforms, we get resources moving from one sector to another to a more productive sector. And that's this green bar here. Within productivity growth is taking existing firms and making them more productive. And that's the yellow bar here. And then there's net entry. There's entry of better firms and exit of worse firms that we also look for. And as we can see from these examples, all 3 of those margins, as we call them, or these dimensions, are relevant, are important. You can see for Chile, between the reallocation, that's largely done. That was done earlier, and so that contribution is fairly small, whereas the entry of new and better firms becomes the important margin, and upgrading of existing firms becomes more important. In Colombia, for instance, there still appears to be more work to be done on that between margin, or there's more action happening on the between margin. So when we think about what is going to promote productivity growth across these different dimensions, I want to focus on 2 broad categories. One is capabilities, and that's going to be capabilities of entrepreneurs, capabilities, and those can be entrepreneurial, those can be management, and those can be technological. We want to talk about capabilities of workers, and all those are important to what I want to discuss, because I think we frequently miss that in the discussions of the model. Second, the enabling environment. And this is where we often focus, and this is where Ambassador Hall started focusing about the doing business indicators, which, while they're presently in a bit of disfavor, nonetheless, I think, call attention to precisely, as he said, many reforms that remain unapproached across our region and which we really need to work on. But I want to talk about those in some detail. The first thing on this, I want to make the case for why capabilities are so important, because we can build the best model, the most cleanest, doing business, top of the scale economy. But what I want to argue is if we don't have certain other things, namely very literate entrepreneurs, technologically literate entrepreneurs with a lot of support from an innovation system and an entrepreneurial system that will help them succeed, we may not get as much out as we would like. And I think we need to focus on that. And one area we have to focus less on are the particular goods that we're producing as a region. And I want to use the example of Chilean copper production to illustrate that. First thing is, this is ancient history, but we're all from the region. We like history. And we see that in like 1860, 1870, Chile was the largest producer of copper in the world. It had about 40% of the market. But you can see that approaching 1900, absolute production and share of the market were pretty much declining. In fact, local entrepreneurs at the time, local business associations were saying the industry was dead. But it clearly isn't dead now, right? It is. You can see that going forward from 1900, production really picked up and the share of market gained as well. Now, what was the difference? Because what we have to register here is the exact same product that was created 14 billion years ago, just after the Big Bang, and has changed relatively little, had two very different impacts on development. And I want to say that the big change was the introduction of new technologies like the Bessemer process that allowed a much more efficient production and discovery process. And that is what made it possible to compete with other countries like Spain, which were introducing exactly those processes. So the message from this is the development impact of the same good can be radically different across time. But I also want to highlight that it can differ across place. In the United States, Gavin Wright says, we became a learning nation partly through copper production. We don't normally think about that, but in his article, Can a Nation Learn? He says, yes, and the United States precisely leveraged copper. It established universities around mining, and I'll highlight UC Berkeley, not only because it's my alma mater, but because it's going to play a role a little bit later. The Columbian Calaro School of Mines, all of these were critical for developing capabilities in metallurgy and chemistry that provided a foundation for subsequent diversification. And in fact, the US companies that developed these capabilities were precisely the ones that introduced the new technologies into Chile's copper mines after 1900 and pretty much spearheaded the process until Codelco was established in 1976. So again, this process of developing capability, technological capabilities, and applying them to copper was key. There's a picture I love from Montana. There's Wisdom straight ahead, the town of Wisdom, the town of Anaconda, where the Anaconda mines are. And these are actually complementary. You have to apply wisdom precisely to our copper. The second counterexample I just want to put up because I wanted you to go home with it in your head, that the second largest copper exporter after Chile in the mid-1800s was Japan. And the copper industry gave rise to numerous zaibatsu, they're mega firms that propelled growth. Sumitomo, you may have heard of Sumitomo Bank, was started as a copper company by the father of copper, Masatomo Sumitomo. Hitachi came out of developing the motors for Hitachi copper mine. Fujitsu, now the fourth largest information company in the world, was started by the Copper King. The question we have in the Latin American and Caribbean region is then, well, we've had copper, we've had mining, we've had all these things. Where are our big companies like those? Where's our Sumitomo, our Hitachi, our Fujitsu in this sector or any other sector, including manufacturing? And I want to argue that, part of that comes because we had trouble and we continue to have trouble adapting and inventing new technologies. In this particular picture, I have GDP per capita on the x-axis, and on the vertical axis, I have engineering density, number of engineers per capita, essentially. And that blue line shows you that Chile, Argentina, Sweden, and Denmark, and the US South were all pretty much the same level of income in 1900. But you can see that Sweden and Denmark had 5 times as many engineers per capita as Chile and Argentina. And that is just a story about the whole region. And I have a more updated graph that I should put in, but I also have a Caribbean country or two, but we didn't have much there either. Okay, so fundamentally, I would say that what we want to conclude from these previous 3 slides and this is it's not just so much the products you're making. It's whether you have this technological capability to leverage them. And as I was saying, it's not just in natural resources, but we look at Mexico and Korea, which started producing electronics in the same time period, and yet we don't have a Telefono Azteca. We don't have a Samsung Galaxy analog anywhere in the region. And we have to ask our question, why? Not in copper, not in electronics. What are we missing? And I think this, fundamentally, if we want to explain the copper example, Latin America entered the second industrial revolution unarmed. And going to the fourth industrial revolution, we remain low along every measure of innovation. And we have to rectify that. Second thing I want to stress is capabilities of entrepreneurs to take risks and manage products. And this table shows the share of significant businesses. We're not talking micro firms that were started by immigrants. And you can see that immigrants dominate. That's Argentina had 80%, Brazil, Sao Paulo had 50%, Chile is 70%, in Colombia, Barranquilla 60%, Santander is 50%, Mexico is 50%. And the last column gives that as a share of their percent of the immigrant population share. And you see that immigrants are way, way overrepresented in business, given their share in the population. And this raises the question, well, then it can't be entirely the business climate, and it can't entirely be the institutional structure. There has to be some kind of human capital that these guys had that allowed them to take a look at the situation and say, oh, I can do this here. Let's do it. That the locals weren't doing it. Now, there's a whole literature on culture. Okay, I want to step away from that for a second. Because there's a lot of evidence that Latin America and the Caribbean had a lot of entrepreneurial drive, but it started behind for a variety of reasons we can discuss, and it slipped as the technological frontier moved into the second industrial revolution. Chile developed the nitrate and copper industries during the peak. They did all the heavy lifting. 30 to 40,000 Chileans and Peruvians migrated to San Francisco during the gold rush and taught U.S. miners how to mine. As a Chilean observers at the time said, we didn't lack that entrepreneurial spirit, but we lost it. The qualities we had were lost. And I don't think people got lazy. They didn't get lazy. It's just the technological frontier moved, and we couldn't keep up with it. We didn't keep up with it. Just another example of that, the one region here, which is totally locally dominated, well, in addition, Minas Gerais is a bit this way too, but is Antioquia in Colombia, where it was almost entirely locally, industrialization was entirely local. And why was that? What was special about that? Well, I think it was a combination of the gold trade with London early on that made them very familiar with business practices there. And then this guy, Pedro Espina, who wound up going to Berkeley precisely as it was being set up as a mining school. He came back to Antioquia. He set up the National School of Mines. And together that led to a golden era of Antiochian entrepreneurship and industrialization. Okay, that has since stopped or slowed down, let's put it that way. The Antiochians, for instance, lost the U.S. textile market to the Asians, and that had to do with problems of quality, productivity, and timeliness, according to Morowitz a while ago. But it's precisely, again, making this point that we have to have entrepreneurs who are capable of evaluating technologies and of evaluating risks. Just today, we lack in these managerial capabilities still. If you, on the x-axis again, we have GDP per capita, and on the y-axis we have global management scores, and you can see that we're not so far above many countries in Africa, for instance, and we're far below the superstars like Japan and US and Germany and all that. Okay, so that's something we need to work on, and certainly it's key to the Asian growth miracles. The Japanese spent a lot of time precisely on building these kind of capabilities. And Singapore, seeing the success of the Japanese productivity movement, just bought it off the shelf and replicated it in Singapore, and they have excellent entrepreneurial support programs. The Japanese Productivity Center also set up the Colombian Center of National Center Productivity Center, which has done this, but maybe less effectively than in Singapore. But we documented in some work we were doing that you can actually improve managerial quality in Colombia. I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time. I want to return to that second category, which is the enabling environment, and put another couple issues on the table. This figure departs from the idea that another measure of firm performance and national performance is the quality of what we produce. Namely, I can sell a white cotton t-shirt for $1 in the United States, or if I'm France, I can put a brand name on it and sell it for $500, right? Or they're actually just made, and there's often a true quality difference, but there are, maybe a design issue, any number of other things. And this applies to all of our products that we export. And if you think of tourism in the region, there are different grades, different qualities of tourism that we could think of that lead to different amounts of value added that that contribute to national growth. On the y-axis here, I have the rate of growth of national quality, the average of quality in nations. And on the x-axis, I have the variation in those growth rates. So why does that matter? Well, just think of Nokia. One day you've got a telephone that you can sell for $500. The next day, no one's buying it. There's a huge variance in the rate of growth of the quality of your product there. And in fact, we know that some products are riskier than others. But what's important here is to see that there is a positive relationship, and the more risk you can take, the more you're going to have higher rates of growth. And this isn't just in quality, this is just a kind of metaphor. This is also in productivity. But what's also interesting here is we find all of the good boys, the United Kingdom, Japan, Switzerland, Denmark, all these guys are up there in the high risk, high return category. And we're down here, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Venezuela, El Salvador. We're down here with the lower risk, lower return categories. So then this raises the question, well, why are we there? Can entrepreneurs actually manage risk, and particularly longer term risk that's implicit in innovation? Can banks evaluate it? I just want to put those on the table as key things we need to study more. Competition. It's essential, but it's low in Latin America. You can see in this recent paper by Deloca and Ecorp that Europe and Latin America are rapidly firm markups nationally are rising over time. There's more concentration. We've been high in South America forever, and you can see that the impact that a lack of competition can have. I'll just choose Buenos Aires for a second. When I went the first time in 1988, it was full of 1968 Ford Falcons. And that was an excellent car. I had one as a kid. The problem is it's not a good car in 1988. And the only reason that Ford could continue building it is because there was no competition. Same thing happened with US cars in the US 1970s until the Japanese came. And this has effects both that within, the between, and selection channels that we talked about, and maybe Diego will talk more about it. There is an issue here, though, and recent studies we've done saying, look, there's more competition without having those capabilities just leads you to fail. So we need to open up more. We need to increase competition, but we also need to build capabilities to enable firms to meet them. Just other things, and then I'll conclude. Education is kind of the most basic form of capabilities, and we're not building them. To give you two numbers, well, we all know that our PISA scores in the region continue to lag those of the rest of the world, and certainly for countries of our level of income, and we need to work on that. But here's another number: only 30% of the students in the region meet the minimum standards for science. Well, where do we think these high-tech and entrepreneurs are going to come from if most of our kids don't meet the minimum standards? And we need to work on that. But then also we know that we lost 1.5 years of education to COVID on average in the region. We need to work on that. Second thing is, while I'm talking about capabilities, a recent paper by Nick Bloom and others says, okay, improving capabilities is key, but there's an interaction effect there too. That's to say, if you devote all this money to building up the strength of your of your entrepreneurs and building technological capability, if you don't have the ability for them to leverage that in having market scale, and that means exporting often, if you don't have the infrastructure to make that possible, if you have a lot of crime and corruption or other barriers, then that's not going to work either. So we need to work precisely on the conventional barriers to growth and distortions that the model, if we will, has been talking about for 20 years, as well as this issue of capabilities. Broadly speaking, the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems is something we need to look at more seriously. I would say, as a gross generalization, there is a delinking, for example, of what we're doing, what the kind of analytics and research that is done in universities and what is needed by the private sector. We find there's generally a low regard in the private sector for the quality of that, and there's very few linkages. That is, in Scandinavia or Asia, that would be seen as a really bad situation. And anybody who knows the US economy and sees the role of exactly UC Berkeley or MIT or Stanford in how we're presenting, that needs to be addressed. But it's not as easy as just copying what the US or what Finland is doing. For us, and this is the hideous slide that I will leave you with as homework, we have to deal not only with the kind of market failures that are relevant to the innovation literature, but all of these things that get in the way of firms accumulating factors of production, including the accumulation of knowledge, and that's the macro context, the competitive structure, the trade regime. All of that is key. The firm capabilities that I was talking about, all this on the right-hand side, that's all key. On the left-hand side, all the stuff I was just talking about in terms of the domestic science and technology system and all that, that's key. We need to work on all these fronts in our economies because we're not Sweden. A lot of these things work nicely in Sweden. We don't have them done yet, but we need to work on both fronts of increasing the capabilities of the actors within our system and keep working on the quality of the system. Just to wind up, this is the World Bank Productivity Project, which I've led for the last 6 years. These are all free, and they all deal with various topics that I've covered here. So please check them out. Thank you very much.
Provided us with substantive food for thought. The presentation was deep and very comprehensive and certainly very, very educational. I would like to turn next to our second speaker. He is Dr. Diego Restuccia. He's a professor of economics and a Canada Research Chair in macroeconomics and productivity at the University of Toronto, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Restuccia, his research lies at the intersection of macroeconomics, development, and labor economics. His recent work focuses on the role of resource allocation across firms or sectors in accounting for their macroeconomic outcomes. His work has appeared in leading economic journals. Professor Restuccia received a PhD degree in economics from the University of Minnesota and an undergraduate degree from Andre Bello Catholic University in Caracas, Venezuela. He was born in Montevideo, Uruguay, but was raised in Caracas. Professor Restuccia, welcome to the OS Permanent Council. You have the floor, sir.
Good morning, buenos dias. Thanks so much for the invitation to participate and to give these remarks. So let me try to share my screen. I hope you see that. Before I start, if I could confirm that you see my pointer moving?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Thanks very much. So I would like to offer some remarks on productivity and the way I want to organize these comments. I will first give you some facts, 3 facts on development that I think are important for us to consider in why we we think it's important to focus on productivity as a means of achieving higher levels of standards of living in the region. So then I'll turn into the specific of some Latin American economies, and I would then show you specific data for Latin America that shows that, in fact, the low levels of income in Latin America boil down to a productivity problem. And then in the last part, just to talk about what may be, what factor may be behind this productivity problem that Bill characterized so well in terms of the different dimensions of this productivity problem. And I will focus on the role of the allocation of resources across firms or across economic activities that may be partly responsible for that low productivity in the region. So let me start with just a bird's eye view of some of these development problems that Bill characterized already. But if you look at comparable measures of GDP per capita across economies, and you look at, you organize them by, here I have them by decile. So these are the 10 will be the 10% richest economies in the world, whereas 1 will be the poorest 10% countries in the world. And what you see plotted here is just the relative average GDP per capita of those countries in all these deciles relative to the United States. So it just shows two facts that were alluded already, and is specific for Latin America. But this is a broader problem in the world that relates to very large deficits in income. So if you look at the poorest economies, they're about 2 or 3% of the GDP per capita in the United States. While here at the top, so the US will be 1, but these countries in average will be about 80% or were 80% in 1960 and have caught up to almost 1 in 2010. And so you see two things: the big dispersion in income across countries, and that these disparities have opened up over time. The same way we see it for Latin American economies is happening for the world as a whole. And so that's the first observation that we really need to understand what's driving both the large disparities and increased dispersion in productivity. Now, the second fact is what I want to argue, and that's why the focus on productivity coming from kind of the policy and the institutional framework in the countries is that these differences are arising from that institutional environment or the policy environment. In some ways, a positive perspective on the growth problem. And so to see this, what I have here is the GDP per capita of countries relative to the United States from 1960 and how that has changed over time. And I say it's a positive view because at any point, and in particular in these examples I've chosen here, I've chosen countries that were at similar levels of income in 1960, but that had a very different performance in terms of convergence to the frontier economies. So at the lower end, you have examples like Botswana and Ethiopia that some are able to produce an important process of growth, where others economies don't. You have, the divergent pattern of Malawi versus China and Korea that are able to do it, or Zimbabwe, Singapore. Almost at every point, you see that. And so it's not something that it's not an endowment problem that says that certain countries are just stuck in poverty, but there's something that changes in these economies that allow the growth to happen. And if we figure out what those factors are, then obviously we have that positive perspective. This table only shows you some examples, but if you look at all the countries in the world, and here is 1960, 2011, and the blue line, the solid line, is just the 45-degree line, meaning points in the blue line will be countries that are in the same relative income position in 1960 than in 2011, whereas countries that are above that line are countries that are able to improve the relative income position or are growing faster than the US, versus countries below the line will be countries that are losing in relative terms. And what you see is that at any point of the income distribution in 1960, you have some countries that are successful, some countries that are not successful. And so we need to understand what determines that success, and what factors, both factors and what policies or institutional features may be responsible for that. So the third fact is, everything I mentioned so far relates to income per capita or GDP per capita as we measure it. And the question is, what's driving that? And so when economists have done these exercises across a large set of countries, then the typical process is to try to decompose this GDP per capita into factors that relate to productivity and factors that relate to the inputs that are put in that productivity process. And even within productivity, we typically try to distinguish between human capital or physical capital accumulation and distinguish total factor productivity, as Bill emphasized. So the main conclusion from many studies that have been done on this issue across country basically argues that differences in GDP per capita and changes in GDP per capita over time are mostly due to changes in labor productivity. And then when we go inside that labor productivity, that is really about this factor, total factor productivity, that explains most of these changes. Of course, as total factor productivity changes, that also affects incentives for capital accumulation or for human capital accumulation. And so this becomes a very important component in understanding the differences in income across countries, as well as their performance over time. So for the particular case of Latin America, what can we say about their level of income and the changes over time? So in 2013, I wrote an article in Economia where it tries to put the perspective of kind of growth and development for the Latin American economies. And so at that point, of course, I only had data until 2009. But as we saw from Bill's presentation, of course, this relative economic performance has not changed that much. And so in that study, I characterized the gap of, in the sample of Latin America that I had in this study, I had the 10 largest countries in Latin America. But I characterized it as GDP per capita being low and not having caught up with the United States. So in particular, for this set of countries, the average GDP per capita relative to the United States was 30% in 1960 and declined to 23% in 2009. And the question I ask in this article is, what are the factors that lead to that? And so is it productivity as we saw for the rest of the countries, or is it about other factors, human capital, physical capital, hours of work, or participation in labor market? And then once we figure out these elements, we can ask, why are these factors low? And this is critical in kind of the research on productivity, is that the more we understand what's the source of this income problem or development problem, the more we can go inside and figure out the policy framework or the institutional framework that may be hindering that particular factor. And so in decomposing, just as alluded earlier for across countries, the first step may be asking, is it a productivity, is it a labor productivity problem, or is it that perhaps there's too little labor in the market? And when you look at this from the perspective of these countries in Latin America, in fact, the problem is it's a labor productivity problem. That is that most of the gap in GDP per capita between Latin American countries and the US is a productivity problem. In fact, if you look at hours of work, it's slightly higher in these Latin American countries. and participation is low, but this factor does not account for much of the difference. Now, note that, of course, in terms of characterizing this income per capita, you may want to focus on the change over time, or you might want to focus on the gap. So as I said here, if you look at 30% GDP per capita in Latin America, it is a decline of 7 percentage points during this time period. Perhaps this has become worse in more recent times, but it's a 7 percentage points decline in relative performance. Another perspective is to think that we need to understand a 70% gap or even larger gap in terms of the level of income with respect to the United States. So in some way, you may want to understand why productivity is low and why it has declined when you compare to a benchmark developed economy. And so now if you go inside the labor productivity and you ask what factors may be responsible for that, human capital, physical capital measures, or this factor TFP. And so for this, you of course need to do more, get more information, more measurements about constructing measures of the capital stock and measures of the human capital stock. But when you do that, what you find is that, at least on physical capital terms, that the gaps are not big enough to account for this difference. In fact, in 1960, physical capital stock of Latin America was fairly comparable to international measures, and it has declined. So perhaps capital accumulation is one component about the decline, but it doesn't explain the low level of labor productivity. The other one will be human capital. This, of course, there's more detail here than I have time to discuss, at least in the opening remarks. But one of the key insights in the literature is about human capital is not just how many years of schooling we have, it's about the quality of that schooling, as Bill mentioned. So one of the insights that is done in this literature to try to quantify the importance of human capital, once you account for the quality of the human capital that is produced, then what you find is a very tight relationship with income. And so using that, you can decompose the labor productivity problem into a TFP gap and a physical capital accumulation gap that takes into account the effect of this income on human capital. So when you do that, what you find is that for these two periods in Latin America, the biggest gap comes precisely from the gap on total factor productivity, on TFP. That is, obviously, that the gap on productivity will translate into lower capital accumulation, both physical capital as well as human capital. And so that will translate into a larger income difference. But the main source of that of those differences really comes from productivity. And when you take these numbers and you isolate what will be that TFP gap in Latin America compared to the United States, basically tells you that it must be around 60% in 1960, about 66% in 2009. So what that says is that there's really, what we need to understand is a gap of productivity between 30 and 40% between Latin America and the United States. And that even though that gap doesn't sound too big, but that gap translates into gaps in physical capital, translates into gaps in human capital and other factors. And so the key question is then, what accounts for this gap in total factor productivity that I just mentioned? So one explanation that I think is fairly obvious, and it came very vividly in Bill's presentation, is that poor countries are just slow in adopting advanced technologies or innovating and adapting best practices. It could be the management practice that Bill talked about. Now, of course, what happens is that many times we have trouble understanding what's driving that slow adoption or that lack of adopting these best practices. So I'm going to focus on another, what I think is a complementary explanation that relates to how resources are allocated across firms or in general across activity in poor economies, what I call misallocation, or what the literature calls misallocation. And one reason why I think this is important is that to the extent that resources are not allocated to the best uses in an economy, that's going to depress aggregate productivity, so that there's a direct importance of that in terms of productivity. But I think another component is that whatever policies and institutions are created that problem of resource allocation, that could become a disincentive to adopting those advanced technologies and best practices. That is, there is a connection between misallocation and those other factors that we generally talk about, the growth and innovation. So everything could be actually be driven by the same underlying policies and institutions. So what do we know about this misallocation? There's many factors that can lead to this regulation that is applied differentially across production units, discretionary provisions, firing costs, size-dependent policies. Actually, I think it's important to understand that many times these policies are not meant to be, to create misallocation, but, in practice, for example, a regulation may be applicable to all producers, but ends up being enforced more heavily among some producers, and that creates that misallocation, and so that connects to informality. Industrial policy, land institutions, financial frictions, trade restrictions. There are many examples on this that I don't have the time to discuss, but that these are reviewed both in the work that Bill discussed already, and that Carmen Pajes took in this book, The Age of Productivity at the IDB, where she shows a lot of evidence of this misallocation in Latin American economies. One example that I want to offer to you, because it's very illustrative of what we mean by misallocation, is this idea of how land is allocated in agricultural economies. In this case, is a figure for China. And what it's showing you is the amount of land that is operated by farms in the Chinese economy comparatively to the productivity of those farms. And the red line is meant to illustrate what a benchmark of what would be a resource allocation of land, or land allocation that would be consistent with maximizing aggregate output and maximizing aggregate productivity. And what you see is that the land institution in China essentially, in average, allocates the land input equally fairly equally across farmers, and so there is a decoupling between the amount of land that is operated by farmers and the amount of and their productivity, and that depresses aggregate productivity. And this is quite significant. So, just as an example, if you were to move from kind of this flat relationship on the land allocation to the red, agricultural TFP in China would increase by 24% within very narrow geographical areas, and about 50% if you look at it nationwide. So just as an example of what misallocation means is the fact that factors of production are not allocated to the best uses. And perhaps in Latin America, it may be more related to how governments support public enterprises that may be not as productive, and they consume a lot of resources. So there are many examples that will have a kind of a similar picture to this. So misallocation is really coming from policies and institutions that generate effects that I call idiosyncratic, because it affects different producers in different manners. Some may be subsidized, some may be effectively taxed. And the other property that misallocation has is that it's systematic. So it may affect some producers more than others. And in particular, it tends to affect those who will benefit more from growth, more from the producers who would innovate and would like to grow, but they can't because these resources don't flow to them as easily. And so this misallocation becomes a tax on growth and innovation or adoption of technologies. And so this really connects to all the evidence that Bill talked about earlier. Here I want to connect it to to the establishment sizes, because it's a symptom of how this misallocation may transpire in the economy. So I'll show you a couple of examples and then I'll conclude. So one is how plants or establishments grow as they age. And so what you see is that in an economy like the US, growth is associated with establishments becoming larger over time. Whereas in countries like Mexico and India, there's a much more flatter growth that you see in these establishments. And so that may be due to misallocation. Similarly, you see that in developing countries, in richer countries, what you have is that the average establishment size, that is the average size of the production units that operate, are much larger. So factors of 10 or more between the developed economies and the poorest economy in the world. So I may conclude productivity is at the core of differences in income and macroeconomic outcomes in general. I think misallocation, broadly conceived, is very important quantitatively in terms of accounting for productivity differences. Perhaps, one negative aspect of this is that it's not a single source. Obviously, policymakers would like to know what's the single thing they can do to change this process, but there are many angles to this. But this is very important because misallocation is an effective tax on growth and innovation. So that leads to much larger productivity differences. And if we tackle those elements that are creating that misallocation, the policy and institutional framework, then not only that will increase productivity through the elimination of that misallocation, but through providing incentives for growth and the adoption of best technologies. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Restuccia. I think that too was very, very informative and very, very helpful. I'm particularly impressed and certainly appreciate the attempts to link the basic factors. I think many of the items that were mentioned by both by the first presenter and you, very, very similar in some ways in respect to the focus on technology, the focus on competition. That was very, very interesting, I think. Focus on education, the management practices. I think you ended up there to some extent, Diego. And so that I think that we do have a few minutes ahead before we receive the next presenter. And perhaps this might be a good time to possibly have those persons who may wish to offer a comment, offer them at this time with the understanding that when Dr. Selee comes in about 10 minutes, we would like to be able to shift to him to have him give his presentation. He's, of course, the head of the National Immigration Institute, and I think it would be very important to hear from him as well. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to the delegates to have the benefit of their questions. I see we have Washington Abdallah and then Hugh Adsett from Canada. First, Abdallah, please. You have the floor.
Gracias, presidente. Me pareció de fenomenal utilidad el paneo que se ha hecho, pero tengo la impresión de que al final estamos con una lectura en clave de diagnóstico. Y con mucho respeto, diagnóstico tiene algo casi de pericia forense, de trabajar sobre el individuo, cuando ya está en una etapa que a mí me cuesta entender el fenómeno de la productividad, pero en términos prospectivos, hacia el futuro. Entonces, quizás Maloney podría, porque vi algunas puntas muy interesantes cuando hacía referencia a los comparativos de Suecia y Dinamarca y, digamos, algunos mecanismos de apuntalamiento, ver para dónde habría que trabajar. Él hizo algunas referencias sobre innovación, tecnología, pero quizás aterrizarlo más en términos de lo que sería la necesidad concreta para nuestra región. Si eso es posible, porque me da la impresión de que hay puntas allí que son sumamente interesantes. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to pause to allow the presenters, Dr. Maloney or Professor Restuccia, to take a shot at addressing that question.
So I'll take a quick shot and then I'll turn it to Diego. The first thing I want to say is to emphasize how complementary Diego and my presentations are, in the sense that his stress on misallocation as being a barrier to, for instance, innovation and adoption of technologies is absolutely key. And in no way do I want to treat these issues of human capital accumulation or managerial upgrading and the like, or innovations, as being somehow independent, something that as a region we can just say, oh, we work on that, and we don't have to work on all the distortions, which we know are there. And so the focus on misallocation is to get to Mr. Abdallah's first point, that entire agenda of increasing competition, of reducing barriers from upgrading, to making sure things like financial sectors are actually functioning well and allocating resources well. That agenda remains foursquare in front of us the way it has for the last 30 years. I do think there are some additional things we want to throw in. And it's like, why, for instance, I mean, Chile has a reasonably clean microeconomy at this point. Okay, so why is managerial capability still so low by global standards? And here's one thing that came across in Stanford professor Nick Bloom's work, where he asked, how good do you think you are as an entrepreneur, as a manager? And then you cross that with the objective measures of their entrepreneurial quality. And what you find is the worse manager you are, the better you think you are, right? You know, some of our countries are really convinced that they're awesome entrepreneurs, and they're really very terrible. And Singapore is the one country in the world that actually thinks it's worse than it is. Okay. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that there's a huge information asymmetry. That if you're kind of not a very good entrepreneur, that means you don't even know where you are relative to the frontier and what you need to improve. And so that's why, so that information asymmetry, which you call that lack of information of benchmarking, I think motivates a lot of the efforts in Asia, for instance, to get firms into a system where they can benchmark themselves against other firms. So you notice that in Japan and in Singapore, the very first stages of managerial consulting are essentially free or highly discounted. They're just trying to get people in the system. And then you say, whoa, I didn't know how terrible I was. Now what do I have to do? So I think that those kinds of programs, which have been pretty effective in the US, in Europe, and in Japan, we need to think about them, though how the design of those needs to be done very carefully, because if we just make them another government agency, it will be a disaster. But that's one area to think about. This issue of innovation more generally, there's a whole literature that talks about national innovation systems and what they need to do and what they don't need to work, and the market failures around innovation. And as a region, we've tended to focus on some of those issues, right? And we need subsidies for patents. We need subsidies for R&D. I'm not sure those have been well designed at all. And I'm really serious that there's a huge bifurcation between what goes on in the major research institutions and what goes on in the private sector that needs to be merged. The successful Asian countries think of that mission as one. We can't afford art for art's sake, as 100% of the research portfolio. So a lot needs to be done there. A lot needs to be done. And if you look at, for instance, to give a concrete example, Finland had a crisis in the 90s. And it noted one of the things was precisely this delinking of research from the private sector. And what it did was it cut basal financing to all the major universities and instituted a program of matching grants where effectively you said, okay, now you're a little short on cash, but if you do this project in Nokia, that's going to, that'll make up for it. Okay. They change specifically the incentives to working with the private sector. And they get rid of everything that doesn't do that. They don't have a tax write-off for R&D, for example, because they don't think it improves collaboration between research agencies and the private sector. Everything is devoted towards improving the quality of those agencies and improving their linkages with the private sector. That's, those things are a little bit, I'm not sure. Diego is in the forefront of looking at these linkages between misallocations and distortions and these other issues. And I don't for a second want to say that we don't need to focus on what we do, but I do think that when you're thinking about innovation systems and all, it may get us into some other territory where we need to think what the institutional incentives are that we set up. And I'm pretty sure that in Latin America, we've got a lot of those suboptimal. On the basic topic of education, and then I'll stop. I'm not exactly sure what the barriers are to us raising the basic education, basic secondary education on the region. But that's been on the agenda for 20 years. Every time the PISA scores come out, we wring our hands. I'm not sure. Each country has its own political economy that we need to deal with, but we can't have that. We will not advance, regardless of what we do to everything else. I'll turn it to Diego.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's it's a difficult question because the answers I don't think are simple. And in fact, in some way, if answers to that question, which is more about what can we do in terms of the policy and framework that will have a real impact on productivity, if those answers were so straightforward, the world will be a lot more developed. So development is a difficult issue. It intertwines with cultural and historical context in many places. And so I think as researchers, what we attempt to do is try to provide, the broadest description of what of those frameworks may be doing, and then at an individual level, policymakers and at the country level, then that has to be navigated together with political economy, with cultural factors, with the historical factors that may be relevant. But I would say, the other reason why providing a specific answer to that question is difficult is that the development problem is not or the productivity is not a problem that we can see on the legal framework, taxes, formal taxes or formal aspects. A lot of what really disincentivizes productivity and growth has to do with effective factors. So that makes it a little bit more complicated because it's not about doing a tax reform that may be easy to conceptualize and to put forward, but it's something about the effective disincentives that work in that economy. So I'll give you one very simple example, but of course the idea is this applies to many issues. So imagine an economy that has a land institution that is very egalitarian. In fact, individuals are not owners of their land. They just have use rights of them. So this is very common in countries like China or Africa. And now some of these countries are trying to move away from that. Let's just imagine that. So therefore, there's not a market for land. Now, those who are productive farmers and would like to expand and would like to innovate, use better management practice, adopt better technologies, mechanize, that requires growth because it's not possible to do all those things, to mechanize, to adopt better technologies without growing the size of the farm. It's just not productive. So lack of growth, lack of being able to expand becomes an effective tax to doing those activities. So sometimes what policymakers do is they realize the lack of growth. And so they think maybe the problem is that we need to provide more tenure security so that those farmers do investments and their economic activity grows and that helps the economy. But what happens is that you give them more tenure security. In many places, perhaps they give you a land certificate but not the ability to sell, not the ability to rent, just a certificate that says you're not going to be expropriated in the future. And what happens is that then no growth results from that. The reason is that for this growth to occur, you do need that reallocation of resources that will make successful activities grow larger, account for more of the inputs, and being able to expand. And so it's really, this is why the growth and the misallocation are so tightly connected. And so for this to work in terms of the policy framework, it's about changing the ability of entrepreneurs and economic agents in general to be able to reap the profits from their innovation, from their risk, from their activities. And what happens is that many of the barriers that are there for that growth are not formal regulations or taxes, are implicit. And so it's really a review of the framework that would allow that growth. I show you that picture of how successful businesses grow in the U.S. economy as they age, and we don't see the same happening in our economies. And so it's about really changing the policy and institutional framework to change that pattern.
Thank you very much, Professor. This is a fascinating discussion, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to return to it after we've heard from Dr. Andrew Selee, who I think is now here with us. Andrew, we'd like to make available to you. You have, before doing that, may I just introduce him? Dr. Andrew Selee, he's the president of the Migration Policy Institute. His research focuses on global migration, special emphasis on immigration policies in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He's the author of several books and has published opinion articles in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and America's Quarterly. He also contributes to a regular column in Mexico's largest newspaper, El Universal. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, teaching courses on global migration. He has previously taught at Johns Hopkins University and George Washington University, and has been a visiting scholar at El Colegio de Mexico. Additionally, Dr. Selee was co-director of the Regional Migration Study Group, formed by the merger of the Migration Policy Institute and the Wilson Center. He was part of the steering committee for MPIs, that's the Migration Policy Institute's independent task force on immigration and America's future. Prior to joining the Migration Policy Institute, Dr. Selee spent 17 years at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he founded the center's Mexico Institute and later served as the center's vice president of programs and later as executive vice president. He has also worked as a member of staff in the United States Congress and has evaluated programs addressing migrant youth in Tijuana, Mexico. Dr. Selee holds a PhD in policy studies from the University of Maryland, a master's degree in Latin American studies from the University of California at San Diego, a Bachelor of Arts degree from Washington University in St. Louis, and a certificate in strategic perspectives in nonprofit management from Harvard Business School. He was selected as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow for the 2017-2018 period. Dr. Selee, welcome to the OS Permanent Council. We're delighted that you're able to join us. You have the floor, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hull. It's great to be here. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. And good to see Secretary General Almagro as well. Good to see you again, Secretary General. Gusto verlo. Our hemisphere, I want to talk about human capital. We capture human capital in the time of mobility. And let me start by saying that our hemisphere is living through a new age of migration. Unlike the last wave of migration, which was primarily about people leaving the Caribbean and Latin America for North America and Europe, this one is much more complex. Today, many people in the region are moving within Latin America and the Caribbean. Sometimes diasporas are returning from North America and Europe to their countries of origin. And there are still people leaving, obviously, from certain Latin American and Caribbean countries to other parts of the world. But it is much more complex and multidimensional than at other moments. And there are at least a few different characteristics of this period. One is that there has actually been some intentional mobility agreements within regions of the hemisphere that have facilitated mobility. We often overlook this, but Mercosur and the Andean Pact and CARICOM and the Organization of East Caribbean States and the Central America Four, just to name a few of the principal ones, these are agreements often tied to existing institutions or existing other agreements, trade agreements, that have facilitated people moving back and forth within certain subregions. They're not all equally important, but they have been significant for some people, very significant in border areas and very significant in some cases. I would say the Mercosur agreement, and to some extent the CARICOM agreement for professionals have been quite significant, among others. Secondly, we're living at a moment of huge crises in certain countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba, among others, that have led to patterns of forced migration and mixed migration to other countries of the region. Of the 6 million Venezuelans living abroad, almost 90%, a little over about 85% are living in Latin America and the Caribbean, about 5 million in all. And that is a migration that's touched almost every country in the region. While more than 500,000 Haitians live in the Dominican Republic, and something that has gone on for a long time, it's been a long and complicated relationship. There are also large Haitian communities in South America, which numbered, recently somewhere between 300,000 to 400,000 people, perhaps more than 400,000, and tens of thousands more in other Caribbean nations and in Mexico. Third characteristic is that there's also continued migration in North America and Europe, even though it's at lower rates than in the past, certainly lower rates than the late 90s and early 2000s. But we are seeing the numbers of countries changing. This has been a characteristic, particularly of Central America, but also seeing larger numbers of Haitians and Venezuelans, Cubans, Colombians, Ecuadorians, and Brazilians primarily headed to the United States, though some people headed to Canada and some to Europe as well. There's a movement of Hondurans and Colombians and Venezuelans to Spain, for example, which are quite notable. Not everyone makes it to their destination, and as a result, some of these migrations that are intended to arrive elsewhere, where people are particularly headed to the U.S., you're seeing growing numbers of people settling down in Mexico, which is becoming an immigrant society for the first time in recent memory, as well as in Costa Rica and Panama. Fourth, we're starting to see diasporas that once left Latin America and the Caribbean return home. Not always in large numbers, but sometimes it adds up over time. You see this in Mexico and Central America and the Dominican Republic, but also Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and much of the Caribbean, actually. And the numbers are quite big. When we talk about now there being 1.5 million to 1.8 million Americans, U.S. citizens living in Mexico, yes, there are a bunch of those that are professionals and people working in multinational companies and retirees. I'll get to them in a minute. But a lot of these are Mexican families returning back with U.S.-born spouses and U.S.-born children. This is a significant number of people, actually, and it's significant in certain countries. So the diaspora is returning often with people born abroad, often especially children, but also spouses born abroad is significant. And finally, of course, the diasporas continue to be very important, maintaining close family ties, visiting, sending remittances, and sometimes even investing in productive ventures in their countries of origin. Although this is not migration, the old migrations that took place, the people that are still living abroad, continue to be a living part of most societies in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there's one final group, which is a small one, but it's worth noting because its numbers are growing, and COVID has actually been significant in the numbers growing, and that is the number of North Americans and Europeans who have moved to Latin America and the Caribbean because they can work from anywhere. These are digital nomads, as they're called. Or because the retirement savings stretch a lot further. In the past, we assumed people moved from south to north, that people went to economies that were stronger, or the job market was a little bit stronger, but we're also seeing people who may be in countries that already have strong job markets choosing to move somewhere else because of quality of life. And it's a small group, but it's a group that has obviously been accentuated by the fact that more and more work is online that allows people to move. So what does this matter? Why does all this matter on a panel dedicated to discussions of declining productivity rates, which Ambassador Hall has asked us to focus on? This is the question of how does all this relate? First of all, it matters because declining productivity is, of course, at the base of why many people leave. Sometimes alone, simply the lack of economic opportunities, sometimes in combination with state fragility and political conflict and criminal violence. But it is a central part of the reason why we see people, those that are still leaving, are leaving the region. And it's why people are moving within the region. But secondly, there's an opportunity here that's also worth capturing. It's an opportunity to enhance productivity. Migration may be a symptom of declining productivity, but it's also part of the solution, as it turns out. The migrations that are going on within the hemisphere are a source of needed human capital, and in some cases investment, to reverse the decline in productivity. And let me give you a few examples of how we should be thinking about this. And these are I'll give you, I think, about 4 examples of areas we should be focused on where migrants are in fact part of the solution, and where if we could think about how we capture their agency, their participation, this could be really significant for the economic future of Latin America and the Caribbean and the hemisphere as a whole. I mean, first of all, we tend to talk about forced migration in the hemisphere as a tragic loss and a humanitarian crisis, because it is, right? I mean, the Venezuelan crisis is a crisis. There's no question. People leaving in mass numbers, Haitians leaving in large numbers, Nicaraguans leaving. This is a crisis in different ways. People leaving Honduras in large numbers. But one country's loss is another country's gain, as it turns out. Human capital of Venezuelan diaspora, for example, which is something we've looked at a lot at Migration Policy Institute, is actually quite large. And if it's put to good use, it can help boost productivity and economic growth in several countries of the region. On average, Venezuelan migrants tend to actually have higher education levels than native-born residents and citizens in most countries where they arrive. There are a couple exceptions, but most countries that's actually true. And they often bring needed skills. They often bring entrepreneurial experience. The question is, how do you begin to take advantage of that? And this requires thinking about legal status, about credential recognition, about financial and credit access. People are often starting, you have doctors driving Ubers, right? You have people working in restaurants who were pulling teeth as dentists, right? You have teachers who are working as street vendors. What if we actually gave we have people who ran businesses in another country, in Haiti and in Venezuela and Nicaragua, who are starting over on the lowest rung. But what if we gave people opportunities to actually be able to do what they've done before in areas that need it, where there's needs for doctors? What if people had access to credit as they're starting over, so that who have been entrepreneurs, who could find niches in the economy where they could be entrepreneurial again? And so I think that's, we've talked about these crises as we should, as humanitarian crises, but we also should start the conversation about human capital and how we begin to think of the options of integration, the options of inclusion, also being beneficial for the economic productivity of the countries where they've arrived. Secondly, diasporas can be a source of productivity enhancing investments. And there are at least 2 ways of addressing this. And they have infinite numbers of permutations, but let me lay out at least 2 ways that are particularly useful to think about this. One is figuring out how to bank remittances, and this has been an issue that's been dealt with in numerous ways, but preferably not only banking remittances within financial institutions, but within local financial institutions that actually do lending to local communities to support entrepreneurship, to support infrastructure, to support education in local communities. There are some commercial banks that do this. Banrural in Guatemala is a great example of a commercial bank that also has a social purpose. It does a lot of local community lending. But there's also lots and lots of local cooperatives, local financial institutions that are particularly good at this, credit unions and co-ops that actually, if they were able to be capitalized through remittances, then are able to do loans for local development in creative ways. The second way to look at this, of course, is partnering with migrants who want to invest in their communities. And the Mexican government has done some of this at a national level with migrant associations, but at a state level with actually individual migrants who want to make investments in small and micro businesses, how to match the investments that they're willing to make with low or no interest credit. And finding the way that people who have left, as you know, almost every migrant who leaves wants to either come back successful, or if they can't come back, wants to at least keep a foot where they left. And so, at least, except for those that have had to flee for their lives, where it is sometimes more mixed, but for most migrants who left for economic reasons, the dream of being able to be successful, not only where they land, but also where they left, remains. And so taking advantage of that to figure out how to incentivize people investing in their home communities in ways that create jobs and spur productivity. Third, migrants are returning home, as I mentioned earlier. So thinking about ways of ensuring that migrants are documented quickly, how they have access to financial institutions. One of the quirks of our financial world is you change countries and suddenly you find out that you have no credit in the new country you've arrived in. There are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, people start over. And that is certainly true with people who do not go into jobs where their institution or their employer is able to guarantee them in some way. So finding ways of banking people as they arrive back, how to begin to recognize people's skill sets, both credentialing, which is skills earned abroad. Some of the same things, by the way, Venezuelan or Haitian immigrants, professionals face in Latin America, nationals of the same countries face. As they try and move into the labor market or return from getting a degree abroad, by the way. So credentialing is a big issue, but also recognizing what a group of sociologists has called the skills of the unskilled. People who have been living abroad are often learning things about entrepreneurship, about managing money, about managing people, about new techniques for doing things. How do you capture and support that? So thinking of migrants who are returning as an asset in the Caribbean and Latin America. And finally, the final idea I want to throw out is paying attention to the small but growing number of digital nomads and retirees from industrialized countries who are moving to the Caribbean and Latin America. It is a lot of these people come in on tourist visas and they stay on tourist visas for a long, they come and go and they stay on tourist visas. Finding ways of giving people legal status and making it easy for them to get into the financial system ties them more closely to the host communities where they live. And so beginning to think of ways and eventually to, investing in those communities and paying taxes in those communities. I think we're going to see more and more of this. I think the pandemic has revolutionized, technology started to revolutionize how we work. Now the pandemic has spurred that along a lot faster. I think we're going to see an increase in people looking at places they want to live rather than where they have to live. And it turns out that the Caribbean and Latin America is full of places that people want to live, that are really, attractive to folks from other parts of the world. And I think it's worth thinking about it as a small niche migration, but one that's worth not forgetting about. So let me just conclude by saying that none of these strategies that focused on very different groups of migrants, but all on migration, will turn around local economies or address productivity decline alone. They should be seen within the wider context of measures that help make economies more dynamic, strengthen education, and build livelihoods for people. The kind of things the other panelists have spoken about, and I'm sure Ambassador Hall has spoken about. Indeed, the more that conditions for growth nationally exist, the more migrants who are arriving or those who have left but want to return or want to invest in their country of origin will be successful in doing so. So this is part of a larger question. But it's worth remembering as we think about economic productivity that while migration may be driven in many cases by low productivity, migrants themselves are key actors in reversing this trend and helping economies grow in ways that can chart a new future for the countries in the hemisphere. And thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you very much. That is, again, very, very insightful, very, very useful. And I'd like to revert now back to our delegates and open the floor to them. I think we have first at bat is Ambassador for Canada, Hugh Adsett. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Pleasure to see you this morning. And I wanted to pick up, if I could, and make a couple of comments. But first, if I can, thank the presenters, all three, interesting presentations. And just a quick word on the last presentation that we had, just to say that very much agree with the comments he was making about the contribution of migrants and migration to the economy. That's certainly, I think, been the Canadian experience. And I was glad to hear those comments that were being made this morning on that. I had a very specific point as well that I wanted to raise briefly this morning. Canada's experience, and I think as with every country in the region with the pandemic, has been a negative impact on labor productivity of businesses. And we've seen the economic fallout from the pandemic particularly devastating for women. And I wanted to pick up on this topic because I think it's worth mentioning this morning, and perhaps our presenters will have some comments on this as well. Higher job losses for women than for men as a result of the pandemic. And we know that women play a critical role in our economies. As part of that, really important to make sure that they have opportunities to meaningfully contribute in sustainable development and post crisis recovery efforts. And we can't talk about women's economic empowerment without recognizing gender inequalities, and gender inequalities that are caused by the inequitable distribution of care work. And that in and of itself leads to poverty amongst women and girls. So it's a topic that's important, I think, for all of us. And I know the issue of gender equality is important for all members of the organization. I'd be interested in comments from the panelists on steps to be taken. I noted a footnote in Professor Maloney's slide that noted in one of his graphs from the 1900s or so that women were largely excluded from the economy at that time. And again, I think their contribution is important to labor productivity and productivity in general. So I'd be grateful for any thoughts our panelists might have on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Next, we have Ambassador from Chile, Ambassador Cort. You have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, resulta muy relevante para Chile la convocatoria de esta sesión extraordinaria del Consejo Permanente referido al descenso de los índices de productividad laboral y el éxodo del capital humano. Por eso agradecemos las presentaciones del doctor William Maloney, economista jefe para América Latina y el Caribe del Banco Mundial. De manera particular agradecemos el que haya compartido cifras históricas de la evolución de la producción de cobre para nuestro país, lo cual no solo es un orgullo, sino que también es un desafío para el futuro. Expresamos nuestra gratitud por la exposición del doctor Diego Restuccia, catedrático de Economía de la Universidad de Toronto, así como también del doctor Andrew Selee, presidente del Migration Policy Institute. Presidente, la productividad laboral constituye un factor determinante de las tasas de crecimiento económico de un país, midiendo la cantidad de productos generada por cada trabajador. La productividad laboral por horas trabajadas en Chile tuvo un aumento de 62% entre 1996 y 2016. Sin embargo, los cálculos que generalmente se utilizan reflejan solo parcialmente la productividad en términos de las capacidades de los trabajadores o la intensidad de su esfuerzo, ya que esto depende en gran medida del uso de otros insumos como el capital, la eficiencia organizacional, los insumos intermedios, las economías de escala y los cambios en la eficiencia de otros factores productivos. Es importante destacar entonces que en la productividad laboral influyen factores internos, como el capital humano en términos de capacitación y conocimiento, y externos, como por ejemplo las herramientas, la infraestructura y la tecnología disponible que inciden sobre la eficiencia del trabajo. Por lo tanto, las políticas de inversión privadas y públicas en infraestructura física y tecnológica condicionan a su vez la productividad de los trabajadores. Lo señalado es importante para definir la relación entre productividad laboral y éxodo humano, por cuanto los proyectos migratorios individuales y grupales muchas veces se encuentran íntimamente relacionados con las condiciones sociolaborales y situación macroeconómica en los lugares de origen. La falta de inversión en educación, ciencia, infraestructura y tecnología generan deficientes resultados de productividad laboral y agravan las ya precarias condiciones sociales existentes, alcanzando en ocasiones niveles críticos desde el punto de vista humanitario. Estos elementos, por lo tanto, determinan de manera directa e indirecta la decisión de emigrar, derivando en situaciones denominadas como el éxodo de capital humano. En ciertos sectores de la economía y la ciencia, constituye un drama la constatación de las llamadas fugas de cerebro o fugas de talento, conceptos referidos a quienes emigran a países con más altos niveles de desarrollo, atraídos por oportunidades laborales y profesionales que no encuentran en sus lugares de origen. Si nuestros mejores científicos, ingenieros, artistas o arquitectos buscan mejores opciones en otras latitudes, solo se ratifica la urgente necesidad de cerrar las brechas de desarrollo que afectan directamente la productividad de nuestras economías. Por otro lado, las crisis humanitarias derivadas de migraciones masivas y descontroladas son también un tema recurrente, y es por eso que los Estados miembros debemos contribuir colaborativa y coordinadamente a enfrentar tanto las dificultades de que genera la situación de seguridad sanitarias y migratorias que están produciéndose en distintas regiones fronterizas de las Américas, como las causas estructurales que generan la vulnerabilidad social en nuestra región. Por ejemplo, en el marco de la presidencia de Chile de la Conferencia Sudamericana de Migraciones, iniciada en septiembre de 2021, por el periodo de un año, se incluyó en la agenda el tema gestión de los flujos migratorios dentro de la región, con acento en la migración irregular, la trata de personas, el tráfico ilícito de migrantes y el papel de los gobiernos locales en la gestión de la migración, así como parte de la coordinación con países vecinos de conformidad con la hoja de ruta Bolivia-Chile, acordada el 30 de abril del año 2021, y el memorándum de entendimiento para la cooperación de asuntos consulares y migratorios, suscrito el pasado 1 de diciembre. Ambos países nos reunimos la semana pasada en una mesa de trabajo entre los ministros de Interior y Seguridad Pública de Chile y el ministro de Gobierno de Bolivia, junto a los respectivos ministerios de Relaciones Exteriores. Asimismo, consciente de la importancia de la cooperación bilateral y multilateral para aportar medidas y acciones que contribuyan a mitigar la compleja situación humanitaria, sanitaria y migratoria que afecta a la zona norte de Chile, se ha desarrollado un conjunto de acciones tanto con organismos internacionales como con países donantes de cooperación internacional, a fin de facilitar la entrega de ayuda humanitaria en las ciudades chilenas de Arica, Iquique y Colchane. Señor presidente, mejorar las condiciones sociolaborales y de productividad en nuestros países constituye el primer paso para evitar, enfrentar y responder a las situaciones calificables como éxodo de capital humano, en cualquiera de sus múltiples dimensiones. Sin embargo, ningún Estado puede, por sí solo, resolver las crisis derivadas de situaciones migratorias, sea que éstas se produzcan en su etapa de origen, tránsito, destino o retorno. Para ello se requiere coordinación, cooperación y colaboración regional e internacional. Es por esta razón que instancias como el Consejo Permanente de la OEA, el Consejo Interamericano para el Desarrollo Integral y la Comisión de Asuntos Migratorios de la OEA son espacios válidos que los Estados miembros no debemos desaprovechar. Señor presidente, Chile reitera su profundo agradecimiento por la convocatoria a esta sesión extraordinaria del Consejo Permanente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ambassador Court. We next have Ambassador Lynch from Barbados. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much. I really want to start by thanking you for seeking to introduce this particular topic for discussion within the Permanent Council. I think in many instances, we sometimes don't quite get the roles that we play and understand specifically the roles that we play in an organization like the OAS. But I want to first also commend the presenters for the wealth of information that they presented. This was huge amounts of information that I think is valuable to all of us. But I begin with this role of policymaker. At the end of the day, envoys overseas are not really policymakers. We in essence are pseudo policymakers. But a lot of the information that was presented today, interestingly enough, I think needs to be presented more widely to our governments and our policymakers within the institutions that really make policy direction in most of these countries. And I will try as best as I can to translate and to transmit what has been presented to me to those that really make the wheels of government turn and the policymakers. But at the end of the day, a lot of what was presented, I think, is much more suited within the realm of those who make policy, wider policy within the countries. But I want to raise a number of concerns that I have. And I want to begin first with the issue of size. Are we actually being able to compare apples with apples in terms of much of the labor productivity of which we speak and the size of our economies within which we work? Now, I know that some will tell me that places like Singapore and the like are small countries as well that have done very well in this regard. But then I ask myself again, are we talking about the same cultural issues that we deal with? Singapore is culturally so different from Barbados, ultimately so different in terms of what they can apply and what they can do and what the government has done over time, what Lee Kuan Yew did over many, many periods after being kicked out of the Malays Federation. And therefore, I want to ask, are we really making the correct comparisons in terms of what we are able to do in our own space? Then the issue of the available resources. We have been struggling for the longest time to get our hands on available resources, particularly coming out of international financial institutions. Even when we try to improve our law, we are then put aside with many concepts that we are middle income countries and we don't qualify for resources. Is available resources to an issue within this entire mix and this entire equation of labor productivity and where we go from there? And then the issue of schooling. I've heard, I really listened very carefully to Mr. Maloney on the issue of schooling. Barbados is introduced into its schooling system coding and robotics, but still we are far behind in terms of the available resources that we can bring to our issue of education and schooling overall, and those that are experts in the area to be able to transmit this information. Now, when you have cultural and historical challenges, are we going in the right direction? And then the issue too of union structures within our societies. On the issue of productivity, I will tell you that what employers, I hear people talking about longer hours of work, what has been done in developed states. I'm saying with countries that have strong union cultures, particularly small countries, seem to struggle with the issue of being able to, of labor productivity. Are we giving the best to our people? Are we allowing our people to be able to do what they can? Aren't there restrictions, particularly when there's strong union cultures, on what we can do? And finally, I will say this, the issue of political relations. In many instances, a lot of our people, because of small societies, small populations, need to go outward to be able to learn, to be able to adapt better, to be able to bring policies back to their own countries. But in many instances, we are restricted. We're restricted by visa allocations, applications. We're restricted by a number of things that restrict that migrant movement to be able to bring back to our countries what we do have. And in many instances, as Ambassador Kaur said, once they leave our shores, it's sometimes even difficult to get them to come back. So I'm believing that there are a number of other variables at play in this equation, and I really would like us to consider. I know there's no one answer, no panacea for the solution for this, but I would really like to hear from the panelists about some of the issues related to cultural differences, historical differences, available resources to us to be able to do what we have to do, and then of course the political relations that we have with the developed states from which we can garner information and practice. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next, the representative for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to Secretary General Luis Almagro, Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez, other members, permanent representatives, alternate representatives, permanent observers, and members of staff of the OAS General Secretariat. Good morning to everyone. Mr. Chairman, my delegation must commend you for bringing forward this topic that we're addressing today, declining labor productivity rates and the exodus of human capital. This is a very important matter, and certainly my delegation is happy that these presentations were done this morning. Nevertheless, and with some regret, my delegation did note that there wasn't much data or focus on the Caribbean in particular. But nevertheless, what has been presented, of course, facilitated my delegation to speak on a number of these matters broadly and specifically as it relates to my country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and if I dare say as well, CARICOM member states. Mr. Chairman, economies such as St. Vincent and the Grenadines are small, open economies, and the issue of productivity and the exodus or migration of persons from the region to North America and Europe has always been with us, and is an issue that we've been dealing with, and I dare say will continue for years to come. Now, in terms of addressing the topic on hand today, declining productivity rates and exodus of human capital, this plays in with economic growth and development, but it has to be sustainable development and opportunities. And let me just elaborate further. In the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the government has reduced red tape over the years. And the government has improved upon and created various incentives to stir private sector investment and growth, notably whether it's reducing personal and corporate income tax rates gradually over the years, broadening the tax base and eliminated other taxes, but putting into place a more fairer value-added tax system, which of course many goods and services are also zero rated or exempted from VAT. In the past, when we had the consumption tax rate, it was various rates for the consumption taxes, and also the rates were very high in some areas and others, but implementing the value-added tax certainly eliminates that problem where you have one flat tax rate. Mr. Chairman, the government as well over the years has increased the standard deduction rates so that less persons will not be burdened with paying an income tax. And that in itself acts as an incentive and will stir productivity. Of course, then there are other major infrastructure projects that the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines implemented over the years, and notably the Argyle International Airport is important because it has already had profound positive effects on the economy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is embarking on another project, which is the modern port project. With that, of course, it will lead to larger ships with other containers. So it really leads to faster processing of goods across the country. Other issues in terms of investing in education through the education revolution from early childhood to tertiary, more investments in technical and vocational education, programs such as the Youth Empowerment Scheme, and also the SET program, which is the Support for Education and Training program. And of course, periodic increases in salaries and wages of government workers, periodic increases in the minimum wages across the country, and even recently, the PRIME program, which is the Promoting Youth Micro Enterprises, where is a program to give grants to stimulate youth and micro enterprises. And really and truly going forward, Mr. Chairman, because there are other structures that the government have in order to address productivity, which is the National Economic and Development Council, the Tripartite Committee on the Economy, the Cabinet Committee on the Economy. These are issues which will lead to activities to generate improvements in productivity. Now, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to conclude right now, in terms of addressing and improving productivity and seeing what we can do about the exodus of human capital. One issue in the region, I'm certain, but I'm speaking from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, is the traditional business class, whereby most businesses play it safe by doing wholesaling and retailing trade. They don't get involved in other activities, and that is an issue we have to work on. And then banks are very conservative in terms of giving loans and so on and so forth. We do not have a national credit system in place in terms of a credit score. Once we work on these issues, I'm certain will enhance productivity even with COVID-19, it has certainly justified the need that we need to have telework policies in place. We can have hybrid meetings, virtual and in person. We need to have more discussions on such policies, rotations of staff, a 24-hour workday versus the traditional workday. Different types of bonuses and other incentives can be offered by both government and private sector entities. I do note, especially in the United States, in some education systems, there have been cases where teachers have done well and they've even gotten a bonus at the end of the year of $10,000 and so forth. So, I mean, we don't have to copy. We can just, within our respective economies and institutions, we can address such matters. The issue of production integration and issues such as the CARICOM single market and economy and the OECS economic union. These are examples where we can do much more work and see how we can generate productivity. Now, in terms of migration, we cannot necessarily stop migration. Governments will have to learn how to work with it and address it. We're coming up with reasonable immigration policies, free trade, but also in terms of free trade, there's an important issue of fair trade that has to be looked at. Protection of intellectual property, that is a major issue, and more emphasis on technical and vocational training. Not everyone can go to university, and everyone should not go to university because we need a more diverse workforce, and persons normally in technical and vocational training and such other trades actually make more money than persons who go to university, get drowned into college debt, and enter a white-collar job, and their salaries are much lower. And more targeted policies in terms of how to utilize our diaspora. Persons are going to migrate, but when they migrate, we need to have policies to ensure we can benefit from their human capital, their financial resources, and so on and so forth. Whether it's through diaspora bonds and other financial measures can really help to stimulate an increase in productivity, and national, regional export strategies can play a part as well in terms of boosting productivity and addressing human capital. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I went on for too long, but I'm much obliged.
Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, we do have to be very sensitive with respect to our time allocations here. I would like to urge us, given that we have some time constraints and given that I think we have 7 speakers to present, followed by our distinguished guests who have come to present to us, it's going to take us quite a while to get through these. So I would like to urge consideration that we limit to the time intervals to perhaps 3 minutes per person. The next presenter is the distinguished representative for Peru. You have the floor, please.
Perdón, pero no lo escuchamos. Señor Rodríguez, si me escucha. Señor Rodríguez.
No se escucha nada.
No se escucha, ¿no?
No
Voy
se
a sacar de
escucha.
pantalla a ver si solicita la palabra de nuevo.
No.
No se escucha.
No se escucha.
Thank you very much. We'd like then to give the next opportunity to El Salvador, and we will return to the distinguished gentleman after that.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos la convocatoria a esta sesión para abordar una temática de tanta actualidad y relevancia para nuestro hemisferio. De manera particular, agradecemos las interesantes ponencias de los expertos invitados Y más que preguntas específicas, mi delegación desea aportar unos comentarios de contexto desde nuestra perspectiva nacional. Sin duda alguna, el hecho de la pandemia nos ha afectado significativamente tanto en salud, educación, trabajo y otros derechos de la población, poniendo en riesgo los avances logrados en el desarrollo del capital humano y los índices de productividad en las últimas décadas, con especial impacto en las mujeres y en los sectores más vulnerables. Estas condiciones adversas se suman o refuerzan a los detonantes tradicionales de la migración, lo que nos lleva a perder valiosos recursos humanos, capital clave para el desarrollo económico y social por la falta de oportunidades. Por ello, el gobierno de El Salvador ha privilegiado la mejora de las condiciones de vida de los hogares salvadoreños, la generación de oportunidades de empleo e invertir en su desarrollo integral para encaminarnos hacia la recuperación de la economía nacional de manera próspera, solidaria, inclusiva, resiliente y con iniciativas innovadoras. A fin de afrontar las causas que motivan la migración irregular, se ha priorizado un abordaje integral de la movilidad humana que nos ayude a prevenir el éxodo de capital humano y se promueva la migración segura y ordenada. No podemos dejar de hacer referencia a la feminización de la migración, no solo por el aumento de las mujeres en las rutas migratorias, sino también por su participación como sujetas activas y protagonistas de este fenómeno, a lo cual debe darse atención particular para garantizar la protección específica de las niñas y mujeres. En ese contexto, se promueven esfuerzos articulados con entes gubernamentales, organismos internacionales y sector privado para lograr una movilidad laboral bien gestionada a través de procesos de contratación con empresas empleadoras, un proceso ordenado de reclutamiento, monitoreo de condiciones laborales, de retorno y reintegración. A la fecha, se cuenta con un importante número de salvadoreños trabajadores temporales activos a través del programa de movilidad laboral, desempeñando labores en Canadá y en los Estados Unidos de América. Paralelo a estos programas, nuestro mayor reto es que la población pueda desarrollarse plenamente en su tierra y asegurar que el derecho a migrar no sea una decisión forzada ni que ponga su vida en peligro. Mi gobierno, además, se encuentra implementando la Agenda Digital 2030, un conjunto de acciones que integra a todos los actores nacionales que participan en el desarrollo del país a través de la innovación y la aplicación de las tecnologías de la información y las comunicaciones. Con su ejecución, se busca contribuir al logro de los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible y también se persigue una sólida posición en distintos índices internacionales como el Índice de Competitividad Global e Índice Global de Innovación, confiando en que esto posibilitará un mayor nivel de inversión y desarrollo para el país. El Salvador, asimismo, se encamina a una reducción significativa de las brechas en materia digital e innovación, impulsando además la renovación de la administración pública y avanzando en materia de seguridad cibernética. Señor presidente, esperamos que este diálogo e intercambio de experiencias que hoy desarrollamos permita a la organización identificar, a partir de las lecciones aprendidas, estrategias innovadoras de apoyo a los estados para mejorar la productividad, fortalecer a nuestro capital humano y fomentar sociedades más resilientes. Muchas gracias.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. The next presenter is Costa Rica. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Costa Rica agradece el espacio de reflexión para abordar dos temas de alta relevancia para la región, tales como el descenso de los índices de productividad laboral y el éxodo de capital humano. Agradecemos igualmente al Dr. William Maloney del Banco Mundial, al Dr. Diego Restuccia de la Universidad de Toronto y al Dr. Andrew Selee del Migration Policy Institute por sus valiosas presentaciones. De manera especial agradezco los valiosos aportes brindados por los distinguidos representantes de los Estados miembros. Costa Rica ha tomado decisiones trascendentales a lo largo de su historia, de las que me permito nombrar la inversión en nuestros sistemas de salud y educación, en lugar de la inversión militar tras la abolición del ejército hace 72 años. Esto ha tenido implicaciones directas en la consolidación de nuestro sistema democrático y en nuestro impulso hacia el desarme y el respeto al derecho internacional como ejes fundamentales de nuestra política exterior. Un segundo ejemplo es la diversificación de los sistemas productivos de nuestra economía para una sustentabilidad a largo plazo. Así pasamos de exportar solamente productos agrícolas tradicionales como el banano y el café a convertirnos en un hub corporativo de shared services o servicios de excelencia, y un país donde uno de los principales productos de exportación hoy en día son los dispositivos médicos de alta tecnología. De igual forma, gracias a un compromiso fiel con el medio ambiente y la conservación que data de los años 70, con la creación de parques nacionales y áreas de vida silvestre protegidas, hemos podido lograr una cobertura boscosa de casi el 60% de nuestro territorio, apoyado con la iniciativa del pago de servicios ambientales a comunidades y propietarios de fincas. Por su parte, la Red Nacional de Energía ha sido alimentada en promedio con un 98% de energía renovable durante los últimos 6 años de manera consecutiva. Costa Rica ha declarado de interés público a la materia migratoria, con un enfoque para el desarrollo del país, de derechos humanos y de seguridad pública, que se atiende de manera interinstitucional. Alrededor de 30 instituciones colaboran con su gestión, principalmente para la regularización, educación, trabajo, protección e integración social, combate a los delitos, el tráfico ilícito de migrantes y trata de personas. Esta articulación interinstitucional tiene como fin el cumplimiento del objetivo fundamental de nuestra política migratoria y de todas las acciones del aparato estatal, la plena integración. El compromiso de Costa Rica sigue inquebrantable para con las personas en situaciones más vulnerables, entre las que se encuentran los migrantes, refugiados y los solicitantes. En nuestro país, esta población representa alrededor del 10.5%, que genera un aporte aproximado del 12% al Producto Interno Bruto, sumado desde luego a la contribución del acervo cultural en su diversidad y mixtura. Por eso coincidimos con el doctor Selee en la importancia de ver el fenómeno de la migración como una oportunidad para enriquecer a la población de acogida a través de su plena integración. Sin embargo, los retos y los desafíos continúan. Enfrentamos brechas estructurales que debemos superar para el desarrollo de Costa Rica, el desarrollo de toda nuestra región. Hemos identificado brechas estructurales relacionadas, entre otras cosas, con educación, género, productividad, innovación, digitalización e infraestructura. Estos obstáculos al desarrollo se han visto exacerbados por la pandemia. Se han puesto de manifiesto las desigualdades, especialmente en el sector educativo y el acceso a la tecnología, así como la disparidad de género, siendo las mujeres, como lo hemos mencionado en la reunión de hoy, las más afectadas por el desempleo y por un fuerte incremento a las demandas del hogar. Una de las lecciones más importantes de la pandemia es que la cooperación y la solidaridad son elementos esenciales para superar las dificultades. Reorientar la cooperación ayudaría a la implementación de la Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible y sus ODS, ya que el sistema actual de asignación no favorece a los países que hacen las cosas bien. Costa Rica efectivamente ha dado avances positivos en su historia. Somos un país de renta media, miembro de la OCDE, que enfrenta desafíos importantes, al igual que muchos de los países del hemisferio. El sistema de cooperación internacional, que se define con el criterio del PIB per cápita, no toma en cuenta que existen diferentes dimensiones del desarrollo, económica, social, ambiental, institucional y financiera, por citar algunas, y no refleja brechas importantes sobre las que es necesario actuar. Por eso Costa Rica apoya el concepto de desarrollo en transición. Como presidencia pro tempore de la CEPAL, solicitamos a su secretaría la elaboración de un documento sobre el concepto desarrollo en transición, bajo el cual la cooperación debe adaptarse a las necesidades específicas de los países y buscar abordar esas brechas estructurales de desarrollo. La cooperación debe ser multilateral, multinivel, interinstitucional y se debe combinar actores tradicionales mediante formatos menos tradicionales, como la cooperación horizontal, regional, sur-sur, norte-sur, sur-norte y la triangular. Las herramientas a disposición de los países deben incluir instrumentos de financiación más flexibles, fondos para el cambio climático, financiación combinada, canjes de deuda por medio ambiente y movilización de recursos internos, entre otros. Esto apoyaría el intercambio de conocimientos, el desarrollo de capacidades y la entrega de las transferencias necesarias para responder a esos estancamientos de desarrollo que mencionaban los expositores el día de hoy. El enfoque de un desarrollo en transición considera el desarrollo como un proceso multidimensional e ininterrumpido, que no termina cuando los países alcanzan un determinado nivel de ingreso per cápita, sino que continúa en las diversas dimensiones hasta que los logros sean sostenibles. Este concepto es complementario a la implementación de la Agenda 2030, pues propone un giro hacia la cooperación que facilite y catalice los procesos de desarrollo, atendiendo las necesidades de los países en la medida en que lo requieran para poder atender esos desafíos estructurales. Señor presidente, continuamos enfrentando la pandemia del COVID-19, misma que nos ha enseñado que debemos impulsar acciones y medidas regionales multisectoriales para afrontar la peor contracción económica de los últimos 100 años en esta región. La dimensión de la crisis que vivimos hace necesario rediseñar las modalidades de cooperación internacional y para ello Costa Rica propone como hoja de ruta profundizar en el concepto de desarrollo en transición y su propuesta mediante una cooperación más renovada. De esa manera, los países que han hecho bien sus deberes no serán castigados con su graduación. Los países que se gradúan aún enfrentan desafíos para cumplir con la Agenda 2030 para el desarrollo sostenible, para responder a las necesidades de los ciudadanos, entre otras, mediante la creación de oportunidades de empleo que prevenga el éxodo del capital humano y que contribuya al crecimiento económico de todos los países de la región. Muchísimas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much. We lost Peru earlier, and I'm going to ask that he be allowed to present next. And again, reminder that to the extent possible, if we can reduce the time allotted for the presentations to 3 minutes, that would help us to get through the group that we have assembled. So next, it's going to be Peru, please. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Un saludo a todos los representantes permanentes de las misiones ante la OEA. Brevemente, agradecer la iniciativa de la presidencia por este importante tema, así como a los doctores Maloney, Restuccia y Selee por sus importantes exposiciones. Sin duda, el tema de la migración y la productividad laboral es un tema que atraviesa no solamente el hemisferio, sino el mundo entero. El Perú no es ajeno a esta problemática. Señor presidente, el Perú tiene más de 3 millones de su población, alrededor del 10% de su población total, viviendo en el exterior. Tenemos presencia peruana en los 5 continentes. El Perú es un país de origen, tránsito y destino de migrantes. Este fenómeno, por supuesto, dificulta el tema del incremento y el desarrollo de nuestro país, pero también debe ser analizado desde otras perspectivas. La fuerza laboral que estos migrantes peruanos y americanos en general, al insertarse a nuevas realidades, a nuevos países, contribuyen decididamente con la fuerza productiva, generando importantes efectos positivos en la economía, la industria, la ciencia y la tecnología, y en otros campos como la cultura, en los países donde son acogidos. Además, no podemos dejar de mencionar, señor presidente, que el fenómeno también debe ser visto desde el punto de vista de la ayuda que estas comunidades, mediante el envío de las remesas, generan para sus propias economías. El Perú apoya esta iniciativa de la OEA y considera que este fenómeno debe ser abordado en futuras sesiones desde otras perspectivas. El tema de la educación, la capacitación de la fuerza laboral, el análisis y actualización de los derechos laborales y sobre todo el acceso a las tecnologías constituyen sin duda otros elementos a los mencionados el día de hoy que condicionan las diferentes magnitudes en las cuales los países del hemisferio afrontan el problema de la fuga de capital humano y la productividad laboral. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much. The next presenter is from Ecuador. Ambassador Getifa, you have the floor, please.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. En primer lugar, quisiera saludar la realización de esta reunión y el muy valioso e ilustrativo aporte de los doctores Maloney, Diego Restuccia y Andrew Selee. La informalidad y la limitada productividad complican y mucho los mercados laborales. Creo que debemos añadir también el factor coyuntural de la crisis sanitaria, la pandemia COVID-19, que provocó la mayor contracción de la actividad económica que ha experimentado la zona en más de un siglo, con una caída del 6.8% del Producto Interno del PIB, así como los retrocesos significativos que ha producido una participación laboral, en especial la femenina, poniendo fin a más de 30 años de crecimiento continuo. El impacto de la crisis en la inserción laboral de las mujeres es resultado de su elevada intervención en actividades que se vieron seriamente restringidas durante el periodo de confinamiento, a lo que se suma el mayor peso de labores no remuneradas vinculadas al cuidado del hogar. Recordemos que entre 2019 y 2020 cerca de 13 millones de los casi 25 millones de personas que perdieron su empleo fueron mujeres. Hay la necesidad de adoptar políticas integradas, incluidas las fiscales y monetarias, destinadas a promover la demanda y apoyar a las empresas, como también las industriales y laborales, que fomenten el empleo de calidad y el incremento de la competitividad. En este marco se inscribe el respaldo prioritario a las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas, que comprenden más del 95% de la fuerza laboral en la región. Convendremos en que el capital humano es móvil, por lo que en regiones en las que exista una mayor productividad y calidad de vida existirá una mayor migración. Según la CEPAL, tales brechas entre países de origen y destino se han venido acentuando, reflejando una profundización del desarrollo asimétrico. Añadiría que el éxodo del capital humano, sobre todo del más capacitado, parece una reacción casi natural ante este desarrollo desigual, y el descenso en los índices de productividad resulta un efecto lamentablemente lógico de este comportamiento. Igualmente, habremos de reconocer una correlación entre productividad y salario que refuerza esta dinámica de asimetría estructural y de flujos migratorios. A su vez, estos movimientos de personas construyen lazos sociales, económicos y comerciales entre países y regiones que pueden ser beneficiosos para el desarrollo de los sectores más pobres, en el supuesto de que vayan acompañados de políticas públicas que reduzcan los niveles de desigualdad. En suma, nuestros esfuerzos deben impulsar la productividad laboral, promoviendo los sectores de la economía que alientan el crecimiento y alta intensidad de capital humano. Las cifras así lo revelan. Mientras en América Latina el promedio de tales sectores contribuye con el 26% del Producto Interno Bruto, en las naciones desarrolladas ese porcentaje supera el 40%. Si el 21% de la población en los Estados Unidos presta servicios en ámbitos de alta productividad, en Latinoamérica el porcentaje se reduce al 8%. El gobierno de Ecuador se había comprometido con la reactivación económica y la ejecución de una estrategia de competitividad sistémica y productividades crecientes, llamada a promover relaciones laborales que gocen de reconocimiento dentro y fuera del país. Una prioridad especial ha sido atribuida al aumento del componente de la innovación y del conocimiento de los procesos productivos. El Ecuador, que como es sabido es un país de emisión, recepción, tránsito y retorno de personas, despliega acciones de promoción de la inclusión socioeconómica de inmigrantes dentro del nuevo proceso extraordinario de regularización de ciudadanos venezolanos y extranjeros que ha sido previsto por el gobierno nacional para su ejecución en 3 etapas durante el presente año. Este proceso estará acompañado de una estrategia de integración socioeconómica que será apoyada por la cooperación internacional y que beneficiará tanto a grupos de migrantes en cuanto a sus comunidades de acogida. con motivo de la reunión virtual iberoamericana de ministros de trabajo celebrada en diciembre último. El ministro ecuatoriano sostuvo que el mundo ha cambiado y debemos adaptarnos, impulsando la reactivación económica con rostro humano, inclusiva y responsable. Para ello, dijo que es necesario generar acciones concretas e impulsar el desarrollo de competencias que contribuyan a la generación de empleo pleno en un ambiente laboral amigable. A este fin, se prepara una ley que ofrezca estabilidad en la normativa laboral para promover la inversión extranjera, combatir la informalidad, fomentar la capacitación y productividad de los trabajadores, facilitar la contratación de jóvenes y disminuir las brechas de género y de discriminación laboral. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much. The next presenter is St. Louis. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, my delegation is pleased that this topic is being addressed today at the Permanent Council, and we thank the presenters for their in-depth and informative presentations. On the issue of productivity, the government of St. Lucia has a number of initiatives in place to address productivity, but at this point I will highlight just one, the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council. This council is critical as it helps with the identification and analysis of issues that affect St. Lucia's competitiveness within the global environment. It provides information to the government, the private sector, labor unions, academia, as well as the general public on the importance, magnitude, and implications of national productivity and competitiveness. It also identifies issues and public policies that will help drive productivity and economic growth and provide real impact to all stakeholders in the space in which they operate. The National Council has developed a productivity measuring tool to provide sector businesses to measure their productivity level with recommendations on how to improve productivity both quantitatively and qualitatively. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go next to the Ambassador Hines. You're presenting, please.
Good morning, good day to all present. I want to join in commending the chairman for introducing this important topic. I have not had the chance to discuss with the capital, so what I will say, I would say that it is much more of a personal view. We must work to understand and explain the economy and what we see happening. But what we want to get to is to answer the question, what is to be done at our particular place and time and circumstances. I think the answer is more a creative, integrative, intuitive activity, and it requires significant immersion and discussion in the particular situation. I think that is often essential. As a political appointment, it may not be surprising that I would tend to put at the base of our questions the social, political worldview of the people and their motivation and the sense we can bring to them of national togetherness. I think if we look at the significant periods of development of various countries, England and Europe and America, and maybe more recently Japan and Korea and China, we've had people talking about Japan Inc. and Korea Inc. and China Inc. And I think that reflects on their situations, the instances which demonstrate that there is a certain common feeling throughout. Everyone feels engaged in a common purpose and activity. I would like to say, don't overlook the persons who are not formally educated. In our case in Guyana, we had lots of studies of maybe getting our agricultural products into the Caribbean. And in particular in the 70s and 80s, it was our vendors, our suitcase vendors who took our pineapples and other things into Barbados and maybe St. Vincent and into the Caribbean. And I think those vendors in time demonstrated a very great perception of relative values of goods, even though none of them may have ever sat in an economics class, but they perceived and they acted according to that their perceptions. I would say too that looking at development, one may see that often you're trapped, as people say, we're trapped in a certain situation, and often you have to break out of the trap. And I think particularly of, say, General Park in South Korea, because at one of the Guyana Korean meetings we had, which I was representing on the Guyana side, the person spoke about General Park broke us out, and at that particular time, he too resisted and joined with all the people in protesting about the investments in capital things. But he said now, 30, 40 years later, it was laying in the capital. You know, he said we used to say, give us food today. We want food. We don't want roads. We don't want ports. So there was this issue. When you're starting out, you have limitations, and there is going to be some force required. Even in Singapore, people talk about Lee Kuan Yew being somewhat of a benign dictator. So those are my thoughts. I think, too, that we must recognize that along the path of development, various strategies, they may change. And I think particularly of references I've seen recently to the term Lewisian turning points after our own Caribbean economist, Nobel laureate, that as development takes place, different things matter. You move through different points. So thank you very much. That will be my contrary presentation.
Thank you very much, sir. We have a bit of a sequential challenge here. We have two speakers to present. We have the Holy See, and then we have one of the panelists themselves. I'm trying to decide if we should let the SG go at this point. Mr. Secretary General, I give the preference to you, sir, to present next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's a great pleasure. And definitely, it's very relevant, this matter, y celebramos la elección de esta temática que apunta directamente al funcionamiento de los mercados laborales de la región, un ámbito que requiere hoy de la mayor atención. La pandemia ha hecho estragos en el empleo. Según la OIT, durante 2020 perdimos el equivalente a más de 50 millones de puestos de trabajo con un efecto desproporcionado en las mujeres, la juventud y en general los grupos de trabajo que ya enfrentaban dificultades en el mercado laboral. En 2021 nos colocamos en una senda de recuperación, pero sabemos que es desigual y no también insuficiente. Del total de los empleos recuperados, alrededor del 70% se da en la informalidad. Son empleos de baja productividad, con bajos salarios y sin ninguna cobertura de protección social. Lograr que nuestra región se recupere esta crisis de manera sostenible, justa y resiliente y generando mayor igualdad tiene como condiciones indispensables reducir la informalidad, promover la creación de empleo y mejorar condiciones de trabajo y su productividad. El éxodo del capital humano y en particular la fuga de cerebros ha sido problema recurrente del hemisferio, originado por la búsqueda de mejores oportunidades y por una limitada capacidad de nuestras economías de generar suficientes puestos de trabajo con ingresos y garantías adecuadas. Hoy nuestra juventud tiene más años de estudio que nunca antes, sin embargo enfrenta las más altas tasas de desempleo. Estamos ante una gran promesa incumplida que genera desaliento y frustración, sentimientos que seguirán encontrando válvulas de escape que no van a estar enfocadas en la productividad. Si bien el éxodo del capital humano es un fenómeno en todos nuestros países, resulta más serio y problemático en algunas subregiones. Vale destacar la situación del Caribe, señor presidente, donde la fuga de talento es una de las más elevadas a nivel mundial. En varios países del Caribe, más del 50% de aquellos que completan educación terciaria emigran, privándolos de un motor de crecimiento económico y generando una amenaza, un contrapeso al desarrollo. Hay quienes argumentan que la pérdida que representa la salida de capital humano en los niveles de crecimiento se ve compensada parcialmente por las remesas que envían quienes emigraron. Estudios del Fondo Monetario Internacional, entre otros, muestran que el impacto general del éxodo depende del nivel de calificación de la población migrante y de la cuantía de las remesas. En general, para países con un número considerable de migrantes que tienen altos niveles de educación, como son países del Caribe, las remesas no logran compensar el impacto negativo sobre el crecimiento que tiene la fuga de talento. El nivel de educación de la población migrante ha aumentado de manera considerable en todo el mundo, aunque con variables importantes según países de origen. Datos nos muestran que en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, muestran 45% de los inmigrantes originarios del Caribe y más del 57% de inmigrantes originarios de Sudamérica tienen 2 o más años de educación postsecundaria. Este porcentaje es de 25% para otras regiones. Para revertir el impacto negativo de este fenómeno, en el desarrollo económico y social, debemos generar condiciones para convertir la fuga de talentos en flujo de talentos. Debemos incentivar a aquellos que han emigrado a invertir su capital humano en sus países de origen, a través de la transferencia de conocimiento y las iniciativas que buscan aprovechar la diáspora. Y por otro, trabajar para lograr la retención de nuestras y nuestros profesionales. Esto puede lograrse promoviendo la creación de empleos de calidad, utilizando a nuestro favor los cambios emergentes en el mundo del trabajo. Las grandes transformaciones que se están sufriendo en el mundo del trabajo, gracias a los acelerados cambios tecnológicos, traen nuevas dimensiones a viejas realidades. Las plataformas digitales, la economía del conocimiento son 2 fuerzas poderosas que tenemos que utilizar en este tiempo. En un mundo cambiante en que la tecnología, la inteligencia artificial, el Internet, las cosas y otros fenómenos asociados a la cuarta revolución industrial asignan un nuevo valor al conocimiento. A las empresas ya no se ven limitadas por el lugar geográfico en el que desarrollan sus negocios para encontrar a personas más calificadas. El trabajo remoto abre un mundo de posibilidades. El éxodo del capital humano hoy tiene esa nueva dimensión. Ahora puede existir sin necesidad de que las personas atraviesen físicamente fronteras. Hoy podemos hablar de migración digital. En definitiva, nuestros países deben seguir trabajando para mejorar la equidad y pertinencia de la educación y la formación de trabajo para asegurar habilidades, para lograr mejores niveles de inversión, de política más audaz en el desarrollo productivo. Actuando en estos 2 frentes a la vez, lograremos que el capital humano en nuestros países se traduzca en mayor productividad y mejor desarrollo. Y agradezco especialmente las presentaciones realizadas por el señor Maloney, el señor economista Restuccia, verdaderamente un apellido de muy grata memoria para todos los uruguayos. Y definitivamente, Andrew, gracias, señor presidente, y tenemos siempre presente su trabajo en cuanto a estimular el rendimiento por resultados en esta organización y los documentos que nos ha hecho llegar al respecto. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. And we have lastly the Holy See. You have the floor.
Mr. President, General Secretary, Assistant Secretary General, the delegation of the Holy See is grateful for holding this special session of the Permanent Council to consider the issue of declining labor productivity rates and the human capital exodus. The current COVID-19 pandemic has produced a serious crisis in so many areas, including the workplace. Many companies have faced tremendous challenges. Some have closed completely or partially. Also, many people have lost their jobs or now have drastically reduced incomes. Consequently, poverty has increased, so has unemployment, and there have been extensive delays incorporating young people into the labor market. In addition, the informal work sector has been raised, particularly affecting female employment. Pope Francis, addressing the International Labour Conference in Geneva in June 2021, stated that the creation of future employment must be based on decent and dignified working conditions that originate the collective negotiation and that promote the common good. In the context of the present crisis, the Holy See considers that a society cannot progress without including everyone, giving priority to workers who are excluded, those in the informal sector, those who undertake work that no one else wants to do, migrant workers and refugees. Many of these do not have access to national health or financial protection programs. As a consequence, the Church calls on governments as well as multilateral organizations and civil society to start a dialogue that will bring together governments, business people, and workers who will seek solutions for emerging from this current crisis in better conditions. In the context of this dialogue, the development of a culture of solidarity will be required, in contrast to the throwaway culture and the search of maximum profit at any cost, which are among the main causes of the inequality that afflicts the entire world. The Church has experience of such dialogues through its local communities, popular movements, and organizations, and it now reaches out as a bridge builder to help create the favorable conditions needed to bring them to a conclusion. This type of dialogue is a priority to guarantee a more supportive and sustainable future for our common home. Mr. President, the Holy See expresses its willingness to help build bridges for further dialogue, building on its spiritual resources and its social doctrine, and involving all political, business, and labor actors. We are all in the same boat, and we have to get out of this crisis together. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for offering those comments. I'd like now to open the floor up to the panelists to see if there are any comments that they'd like to share on the vast array of issues that have been brought up. You have the floor in sequential order. I'd like to take them as they come in. First, we have Dr. Restuccia. You have the floor, please.
Thank you. Yeah, in the interest of time, I just wanted to make a comment on the issue of gender, and I think more broadly, the issue of inclusion. In some places, the race or other groups may be also a factor. And so this issue was raised by Canada, and I think it was mentioned throughout in the discussions, both in the context of the pandemic as well as I think is a more general issue. I'm going to try to connect it to misallocation, and you see why in a moment. So to the extent that you have groups of individuals in the economy that are not fulfilling their potential, that we can broadly describe as a misallocation of talent. Of course, the talent needs to be developed, human capital, and so on. So that's another dimension. But to be more specific, if women cannot access to jobs as lawyers or as medical doctors in certain economies, one would suspect is generating a misallocation of talent, or if women are culturally expected to be at home and not participate in the labor market, that's another form of a misallocation of talent. And this is very important, not just in terms of what happened in the region and in the world in general with the pandemic that is affecting particularly women and other groups, but it's an issue that is very important for productivity. As an example, I want to share a recent academic paper was published in 2019 in one of the most prestigious journals in economics. And basically, this article documented the gaps in the occupations that happen in the US across genders and across race, comparing 1960 to the 2000s in the US economy. We're talking about a developed economy. And so these gaps that they report really point to the significance of this issue of discrimination or barriers to participation or misallocation of talent in general for productivity. And so they quantify that during this period of time where there is a convergence in the gender dimension and the race dimension on occupations in the US economy and on the participation in the labor market, between 20 and 40% of the overall growth in the US economy can be attributed to that convergence, can be attributed to that reduction in the misallocation of talent in the US economy. So I think that's a first order issue. And sometimes it's, as we mentioned, and as Barbados pointed out, is intertwined with cultural issues and other factors. But that's, those are actionable through policy. So I think this is an issue that will be very interesting, as Mr. Almagro pointed out, on how technology is also interacting in this. In academic markets, for instance, we see how the virtual conferences and the virtual seminars in the academic market has increased participation along the gender dimension. So this is something that certainly there will be opportunities to close. But as I pointed out, the productivity effects of this better allocation of talent in an economy through inclusion, through these groups, reaching their potential is quantitatively is quite significant.
Thank you very much. We have next Dr. Maloney. You have the floor, sir.
Hi, I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to go in a minute, but I'm very glad to discuss any of these issues with anybody else who would like to. I just wanted to quick say something on the Caribbean issue about size, and that was brought up by the ambassador from Barbados: size and culture and quality, and vocational training. I think it was also brought up by St. Vincent. The issue of size makes it not apples and oranges. It makes it apples and oranges. You're entirely right. If you have a very small economy, you'll never get the scale, or it's very going to be hard to get the scale you need to get high productivity from the internal market, obviously. That makes it necessary to be open and to have market agreements with a lot of other countries, obviously. I think a bigger problem there is on just the labor side, which is you may have someone who's born there who's going to be just the best downhill skier, but they're not going to be able to realize their potential in St. Vincent. And you can imagine many cases where a very small local economy is not going to allow everyone to reach their potential. And this is something we need to think more about in the context of the migration discussion that was discussed. On the issue of quality, obviously, we talked about that in tourism a little bit. We all know that the more you raise the quality of your offering, the higher the profits are, the higher the value added is, and that's a key component of productivity. Just if you get a higher price, that shows up in your productivity, if it doesn't imply, offsetting higher costs. On the vocational training thing, I just wanted to flag that that's a very important issue, and there was a recent report put out by the bank called the Fast Track. And it's exactly on what are called short cycle or community college courses. And the entire region is short on what we call técnicos y tecnológicos. That's to say people with 2-year degrees focusing on technical skills. The entire region is short on that. And we probably do need to reorient some of our spending towards those sorts of community college type programs, and there's vocational programs as well, a little bit away from 4-year bachelor's courses. Just to show that I haven't completely neglected the Caribbean also, in the report that we did on engineers, it turns out that the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and Cuba all had universities before 1900, but none of them had an engineering department that was graduating engineers before 1900. So that's why in our analysis, we don't have a very high density of engineers there. There are lots of excellent questions raised. Also, just one point for the Canadian ambassador, just we have to be a little careful that people are adapting to COVID as families, not as individuals. So it may very well be that a family sits down and says, someone has to stay home and deal with the kids who aren't in school. I have a job at a construction site that's fairly safe. Your job is in the market. That's not so safe. Why don't you stay home? We need to incorporate these kind of family optimization issues when we're looking at these numbers of how many people have lost their jobs or left the labor force. I think that's important. I have to leave, but thank you all very much for this opportunity, and I hope we can continue the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that a great deal. Dr. Selee, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I appreciate the comments of the ambassadors and permanent representatives. Very helpful to hear them. And I just wanted a brief comment, actually, is just to say, I think much of what I talked about in terms of how countries can take advantage of human capital of migrants, both migrants that are arriving in the countries and migrants that live abroad, is actually already happening. It's not happening everywhere in the same way, but you can find good examples of this. So, I mean, Costa Rica, for example, the ambassador of Costa Rica spoke. It is the country with the highest, at least in Latin America, perhaps not in the Caribbean, with the highest percentage right now of foreign-born population. Costa Rica has been very proactive on trying to figure out how to provide legal status and integrate migrants, especially from Nicaragua, but also from other countries, into the country. Now, is there more that can be done? Definitely. Peru, so the ambassador of Peru spoke about this. I mean, Peru has been also gone out of its way to try and provide legal documents, and during COVID actually took advantage of foreign-born doctors from Venezuela as part of the frontline response to COVID. How you build on that then in terms of legal status, to build on also credential recognition and taking advantage of people, for example, medical personnel, to be able to be credentialized in return for going to parts of the country where there are real needs for medical professionals. There's some real opportunities out there. There are huge opportunities out there in terms, Canada, of course, the ambassador of Canada spoke about Canada's integration. I mean, Canada is a model globally in terms of how you do thoughtful migration policy. In terms of human capital, Canada thinks about migration primarily in terms of human capital. Obviously does some refugee resettlement and has an active asylum system, but primarily thinks about immigration in terms of human capital and how, and even with asylum, even with asylum and refugee resettlement, takes a lot of care to look at not just how to be humanitarian, but how to look at refugees and asylees as people who are going to contribute to the economy and to the communities where they go. And I think, so just to say, and I could go on, several of you made other comments I thought were very valuable about this. Many of these things are happening right now in the region. I think there are enormous attempts. The question is, how do we begin to build on them? And how do we begin to think of migrants as assets and not just as a problem to be solved? Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Dr. Hall, Ambassador Hall.
You're most welcome, sir. As we close, I'd like to draw your attention to two events that are occurring. There's a meeting this afternoon, a special meeting this afternoon, special caucus meeting at the PC at 3:30 this afternoon. And secondly, I'd like to announce that on March the 9th, we will be having a follow-up discussion related to this issue I think the intent is to pick up on several of the themes that have been addressed here. One of them, of course, is how do we transition from where we are to get to where we'd like to go? And for that, I have invited an expert from Deloitte Touche, who's had 30 years with Deloitte Touche. He's a chief global information technology expert. And he's done a lot of work in terms of working with students, with companies, with groups both in India and Brazil and other places, with actually trying to show them how they can be transformed to move quickly into these higher income earning occupations. So he's very much on tap and has confirmed that he will participate. I also have someone from Korn Ferry. This is an expert at the senior partnership level that will be dealing with incentives to motivate individuals to push a little harder than they've been currently doing. I've missed the opportunity for inviting Dr. Freeman Hrabowski. He's the president of the University of Maryland Baltimore campus. He is an expert in this area in actually taking folks from the back of the line and moving them forward. He has done that very, very successfully in terms of taking Black persons to move them who've come in fairly at very low levels and has been able to work with them and transform them into becoming highly productive citizens with PhDs in both the sciences and in engineering. Just a week ago, he received a very high honor from Yale University, who named him the Legend of the Year. And in the same week, his university, UMBC, was awarded an R13 delegation, naming his university as one of the top schools in the country for producing doctoral graduates. It's quite an achievement. I was instrumental in getting him to come down to St. Kitts 2 years ago to deliver a lecture in terms of transforming individuals to help them to become more productive. We missed the opportunity for getting him this time. I did contact him. He's not available, but he has made a commitment to recommend someone who will stand in his place. So that's coming, and that will occur. That next session will occur on March the 9th. For this, I'd like to thank the presenters for the outstanding work that they've done in exposing us to a number of possibilities that we really may not have fully developed in the past. One in particular is this transformational. How do you take persons from the back of the line and move them quickly? And the last comment made by Dr. Selee points to the fact that you could really try to have these expedited courses. You're not dealing with persons who have to be in a medical school for 7 years or something like that. It's training them quickly, and you're seeing more and more of that happening. And I'm certainly hoping that we can actually bring some folks in to actually to do this. So again, thank you very much to the presenters. I look forward to continuing, to follow the work that you're doing, and I wish you all the very best in this undertaking that you've been pursued. Ladies and gentlemen, this adjourns our meeting for today. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.